It began in the dead of winter, in the black waters of the Atlantic, when the ocean itself became a weapon. The year was 1942, and the United States had just entered the war. Across the ocean, Germany's U-boat fleet, the silent predators of the deep, prepared to strike at a new and unguarded frontier. The operation was codenamed Polkenschlag, or Drumbeat, a word chosen for its rhythm, its violence, and its promise of shock. To the men who commanded these submarines, it was the beginning of a new hunting ground. To the people of America's East Coast, it was the moment when the war that had raged an ocean away finally arrived on their doorstep. At the start of 1942, America was unprepared for what was coming. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered illusions of distance and safety, yet the nation's coastal defenses remained scattered, outdated, and slow to react. Lighthouses still guided ships. Cities from New York to Miami kept their lights blazing at night, their reflections glittering across the water like a highway for enemy periscopes. Merchant convoys had not yet been organized, and ships sailed independently. Easy prey for the hunters already on their way. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat arm, saw opportunity where others saw risk. With Britain's coastal waters growing too dangerous, he turned his gaze westward, toward the long, undefended coastline of the United States, a line of light stretching 1,200 miles into the sea. In January 1942, the first wave set out. 5 U-boats, small steel-grey wolves of the deep, crossed the freezing Atlantic under radio silence. They were manned by young men hardened by years of war, men who viewed the ocean as both ally and enemy, their mission to cripple American shipping, to choke supply lines before they could feed Britain's war effort, and to send a message that nowhere, not even the New World, was beyond the reach of the Reich. They arrived quietly, gliding beneath the surface like ghosts. Within days, the waters off Cape Hatteras and Long Island erupted in fire. Tankers, freighters, and passenger ships went down one after another, their explosions lighting the night sky in eerie brilliance. Survivors clung to lifeboats as the silhouettes of their killers slipped silently away. The results were devastating. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, more than 300 Allied ships were sunk off the American coast. Oil washed ashore in thick black waves. Bodies and wreckage drifted onto beaches from New Jersey to the Carolinas. Fishermen found the sea littered with debris, barrels, life vests, fragments of wood still smoldering. The Americans called it the Second Pearl Harbor, but there had been no warning sirens this time. No airplanes overhead, only sudden fire on the horizon and the steady drumbeat of explosions in the dark. The U-boat captains, emboldened by their success, began referring to the campaign as their happy time. Yet even as they triumphed, the toll on the men themselves was heavy. Months at sea, endless tension, and the knowledge that each patrol might be their last. As the weeks passed, the United States began to learn. Coastal blackouts were enforced. Merchant convoys were organized, escorted by destroyers and aircraft that hunted by sonar and radar. The tide began to shift. What had once been an easy hunt became a deadly contest. By the summer of 1942, the hunters had become the hunted. Depth charges thundered through the water, splitting the silence with explosions that shook the sea floor. The U-boats that had once prowled freely now found themselves trapped, pursued, and destroyed. Operation Drumbeat had begun in triumph, but it ended in fire and ruin as American naval power awakened and the Atlantic turned against its invaders. And yet, even in defeat, the operation left its mark on history. For those few months, the Atlantic coast had become a front line, a place where the illusion of safety vanished beneath the glow of burning ships. It was a grim reminder that modern war no longer respected distance or innocence. The battle for the Atlantic had reached its most personal point, not in distant oceans but in sight of American beaches where ordinary citizens watched from boardwalks as tankers burned on the horizon. Tonight, we dive beneath those waves once more, into the cold depths where steel beasts hunted, and into the quiet courage of the men who fought to keep the sea alive with hope. This is the story of Operation Drumbeat, the silent war fought just beyond the shore. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? The air in the Reichschancellery's war map room was heavy with cigarette smoke and calculation. Around a vast table lit by low red lamps, officers moved small wooden markers across the Atlantic. Silent, deliberate, exact, Admiral Karl Dönitz, in his crisp black uniform, stood motionless, eyes fixed on the American coastline outlined in pale chalk. The war had changed overnight. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened a new enemy, one vast industrial and, for now, unguarded. A staff officer, Lieutenant Kruger, noted the glaring absence of convoy lines along the eastern seaboard. Dönitz didn't need to say what everyone already understood. The opportunity was immediate and immense. America's coast, from New York to Florida, gleamed undefended in the winter darkness. He tapped the map once. "Operation Paukenschlag," he murmured. "Drumbeat." And the room for a moment was as silent as the sea before a storm. Orders traveled swiftly through encrypted radio channels to the U-boat pens along the French coast. In Lorient, Saint-Nazaire and Brest, steel leviathans stirred beneath concrete roofs slick with condensation. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan of U-123 read the message aloud to his crew. They were to strike America's coast, not Europe's lifeline. Men grinned, some from pride, others from disbelief. They'd spent years hunting convoys across the grey North Atlantic. Now they would carry the war to the New World itself. Outside, cranes swung over the narrow pens as dock workers loaded torpedoes marked with chalked numbers, each a promise of destruction. Diesel fumes mixed with the cold salt air, clinging to wool uniforms and the sharp tang of oil. What none of them knew was how easy the first kills would come, nor how quickly fortune would reverse. For now the mission felt like destiny. The ocean was calling, and Germany would answer with steel and silence. Inside U-123, preparations took on the rhythm of ritual. Chief Engineer Karl Schütze checked every valve, every gauge, his hands blackened by grease and cold. In the torpedo room, sailors whispered as they loaded G7E electric torpedoes. No wake, perfect for night attacks. Above them, in the officers' mess, Hardigan unrolled fresh navigation charts of the American coast, tracing shipping lanes with his finger. The men had heard stories of glowing skylines and merchant ships sailing fully lit, as if peace had never ended. He wondered if the enemy even believed the war had reached them. Nearby, a cook poured black coffee into tin mugs, the smell cutting through the metallic chill. Outside, a church bell rang faintly through the harbour fog. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Atlantic waited, vast and unknowable. What they didn't yet realize was that the ocean, too, would remember their journey and their arrogance. At dawn, the dockyard sirens wailed. Families stood on the breakwater, faces blurred by mist and distance. The U-boats eased out of their pens one by one, engines humming low beneath the surface like a heartbeat. On U-123's conning tower, the German naval ensign snapped in the wind, sharp against the pale sky. Hardigan lifted his binoculars toward the west. nothing but grey infinity. Below deck, sailors lay in bunks stacked 3 high, clutching small keepsakes, a letter, a photograph, a scrap of ribbon. The air inside was thick with diesel and nerves. As they cleared the harbour mouth, Dönitz's final transmission arrived. "May God be with you.
Please make the enemy feel the war he has begun."
A petty officer switched the radio off.
The engines deepened their growl.
The coast of France fell away, and with it the last glimpse of home. The crossing was long and merciless. The Atlantic in January was no ally. Waves rose like mountains and the sky pressed low with iron clouds. Inside the boat, the temperature hovered near freezing, condensation dripping constantly from the hull. Each man learned the rhythm of confinement. 6 hours on watch, 12 hours of stillness. They ate cold sausages and hard bread, the air forever smelling of diesel and sweat. The navigator, Lieutenant Fisher, plotted courses through fog so thick it seemed to erase time itself. On the 5th night, they surfaced briefly to recharge batteries, the conning tower breaking through a world of black water and stars. Somewhere beneath that vast emptiness, they felt invisible and invincible. Yet even as they cut westward, Allied codebreakers in Britain intercepted fragments of their transmissions. No one aboard U-123 could imagine how closely fate was already watching. Back in Berlin, Dönitz received situation reports from the Atlantic U-Boat Command. 5 boats had departed, the first drumbeaters. Their mission: disrupt American coastal shipping and paralyze confidence in the Atlantic economy. The admiral dictated notes to his aide, his pen scratching over thin paper. Strike swiftly, create panic, withdraw before organized resistance forms. He paused, eyes distant. Every successful attack would draw the Americans deeper into the Atlantic War, forcing them to divide their strength from the Pacific. It was strategy written in silence, one that relied on the enemy's arrogance. A telegraph operator entered, handing him an encrypted reply. U-123 had reported calm seas and smooth progress. Dönitz nodded once. "They will never expect us there," he said softly. What he didn't yet know was that victory's first taste would come swiftly, but so too would its shadow. By the 2nd week of January, the crew of U-123 had crossed the mid-Atlantic Gap, that deadly no-man's land between Allied air cover. The ocean here was alive with unseen tension. Every sound mattered. A creak, a knock, a whisper of machinery. Hardigan stood at the periscope, staring toward the faint suggestion of a western horizon. He thought of the cities waiting beyond it. New York, Boston, Norfolk, unaware of what was coming. Below, his men passed time with quiet rituals, carving names into bulkheads, playing cards by red light, smoking until the air stung. They had been promised an easy campaign, a second happy time, as the Kriegsmarine called it, but the ocean had its own temperament. In the weeks ahead it would test them not just as sailors but as men. For now, they pressed forward into the unknown, guided only by faith in their orders and the hum of their engines. Night fell like a slow curtain over the Atlantic. The horizon disappeared, leaving only the phosphorescent shimmer of waves against steel. Hardigan ordered the sub to surface, the cold air biting at his face as he watched the compass steady due west. Below, men spoke in whispers, the silence of routine masking a deeper anxiety. In Berlin, the radio operators waited for the first success report. The signal that would announce Germany's reach had grown across an ocean. The war in Europe had consumed nations. Now it would touch the shores of a continent that still believed itself safe. Far below the moonlit sea, the U-boat's propellers turned methodically, pushing through darkness like a heartbeat. The mission was underway. The tide of history, invisible but inevitable, had begun to move. The first wave struck before dawn, sleet slashing sideways across the deck, turning the Atlantic into a frozen expanse of grey. Above, two lookouts clung to the rail, their goggles rimmed with ice, scanning a horizon that no longer existed. Inside the control room, Kapitan Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan leaned over the chart table, tracing a pencil line westward across a trembling map. The air was so cold that ink in the logbook stiffened. Behind him, the diesel engines drummed like distant thunder, each rotation a vibration through steel and bone. "We're leaving Europe behind," his navigator murmured, voice muffled by the hum of machinery. Hardigan didn't look up. He already knew. The lighthouse at Lorient had vanished hours ago, swallowed by fog and memory. Ahead lay only distance, silence, and an ocean older than any war. The crossing had begun. Day by day, routine replaced comfort. Every man aboard the U-123 followed the clockwork rhythm of survival. 6 hours on watch, 6 in restless sleep, 12 in waiting. The temperature below decks hovered near zero, condensation dripping endlessly from the curved ceiling. Sailors wore the same wool uniforms for weeks, the fabric stiff with salt and oil. They learned to move without speaking, to navigate by feel, each lever, valve, and switch memorized in darkness. The galley's single stove struggled to warm tins of soup that tasted faintly of iron. Laughter was rare, whispered when the engines quieted, and someone told a story of home. They were alone, hundreds of miles from rescue, sustained by duty and diesel fumes. What none of them imagined yet was how isolation itself would become an enemy. The ocean, patient and merciless, was already closing its hand around them. When the storm came, it rose without warning. Waves slammed against the hull, drenching the deck gun in freezing spray as the submarine rolled 30 degrees with every crest. The helmsman fought to keep the bow aligned, his hands white on the wheel. Hardigan ordered a dive to 50 meters. Safety beneath the chaos. The sound changed instantly, from the roar of wind to the low groan of steel bending under pressure. Lights flickered, casting the men's faces in alternating shadow and red glow. "Ballast steady," the chief engineer called, voice calm, rehearsed. They had done this before, but the sea's violence never lost its edge. For hours they rode it out, engines throbbing in rhythm with the storm above. When they surfaced, the sky was bruised with dawn. The sea had spoken, reminding them who commanded this domain. By the third week, silence became both comfort and curse. The radio room remained sealed, its operator, Matrose Neuberger Freiter Schulz, bent over static-laden transmissions. The Enigma machine clattered softly, decoding fragments of orders from Lorient. "Maintain radio silence. Proceed west." Schulz wiped condensation from the casing. Even the machine seemed to sweat. Outside, sonar pings occasionally rippled through the water, faint and ghostly. Allied patrols were rumored to roam far north, but none had been sighted. Hardigan listened to the reports in silence, then folded his arms and stared at the periscope lens. Fogged from his breath, every sound became suspect. The shifting of a wrench, the settling of ballast, a distant thump that might be imagination. What they didn't yet know was that this eerie quiet would soon be broken by the first American radio signals, ships transmitting in clear, unencrypted tones. The enemy, it seemed, was still asleep. The crew moved through their routines like clockwork ghosts. Navigator Fisher plotted their course with trembling fingers, the pencil tip dull from use. In the cramped torpedo room, Sailors checked firing circuits by lamplight, whispering over the hiss of compressed air. The smell of machine oil, sweat, and damp bread blended into something uniquely U-boat, a scent that no man would forget. Above, the Atlantic stretched endless and unbroken, its surface indifferent to the men it carried. A young seaman named Dieter kept a diary, scribbling on the back of ration labels, "We chase a horizon that never arrives." Hardigan read it once, silently, then handed it back. "Keep writing," he said. "Someday, someone will want to know how it felt." The boy nodded. What neither could know was that his final entry would stop mid-sentence. The sea would take the rest. One evening, as the U-123 surfaced to recharge batteries, the wind died. The horizon bled from black to cobalt, the stars sharp as knives above the conning tower. Hardigan climbed out, his breath turning white against the air, and looked west. The ocean was unnaturally calm, a mirror stretching beyond sight. Behind them, Europe was gone, invisible now, like a dream half-remembered. The radio man tuned briefly to civilian frequencies. Faint jazz drifted through the static. An American station carried by atmospheric chants. The sound was ghostly, almost sacred. Laughter, music, a world unaware of what approached. Below, the men listened in silence, each lost in his own memory. The music faded, replaced by static. No one spoke. They had crossed into the unknown, where only the ocean and destiny waited. For Allied sailors, this stretch was a nightmare, a place beyond air cover, beyond help. For U-123, it was sanctuary. Days passed without sight of another vessel, only the slow rise and fall of the sea. In the control room, dials glowed faintly, needles trembling with each fluctuation of pressure. Hardigan marked their progress on the map, a long, thin line curving toward the American coast. Still no escorts, no aircraft, the first officer noted. Half in disbelief, Hardigan nodded. They'll come soon enough. He knew how fragile invisibility could be. Already, British intelligence in Bletchley Park had begun piecing together intercepted signals, a whisper that U-boats were moving west in force. But the Atlantic was vast, and time was still on their side. For now, the deep kept its secrets. On the 22nd day, faint traces of land-based radio traffic filled the headphones. American coastal chatter, unencrypted and naive. The navigator triangulated bearings, heart pounding. "We're close," he said. The air inside the boat changed, the smell, the sound, even the silence had new weight. They were nearing the continent no German warship had touched since 1918. Hardigan gave the order to surface before dawn. The men climbed the conning tower and stared at the faint glow on the western horizon, a smear of light where New York's coast should be. For a moment none spoke. Even the sea seemed to still itself. They had crossed an ocean, unseen and unstoppable. The world we knew, Hardigan thought, is somewhere behind us. The camera opens on a pier lighted by a single swinging lamp, where longshoremen stack crates and speak in low voices while a distant band plays on the boardwalk. Captain Samuel Hayes, master of the freighter Cornelia May, walks the deck in a peacoat, breath turning to steam, checking hatch seals as if they were the last small assurances of order. He glances at the city skyline, skyscrapers stabbing the night with warm, honest light, and feels for a moment the war is a far-off rumor. Onshore, Mrs. Evelyn Ross twirls beneath crystal chandeliers in a seaside ballroom, her dress catching and throwing the lamps like small stars. Radios in hotel lobbies broadcast comfort, jazz programs, shipping forecasts, minor headlines that do not yet mention attacks in American waters. Tankers wait at anchor, their silhouettes sharp against moonlit water. funnels reflected in calm ripples as if painted by a steady hand. The harbour smells of salt, coal smoke, and citrus from a fruit stand closed for the night. Men whistle as they roll barrels. Women laugh while dancers take breath between songs. In this hour, routine feels like safety. What they didn't yet know was how quickly that safety would be measured against the cold, patient calculus of the sea. Hayes signs the mate's log with a careful hand and notes the compass bearing out to sea for dawn, a small ritual that anchors him to the known world. The Cornelia May is loaded with canned food and kerosene. Her hull rides low, the draft read on the bulkhead gauge in faint, green numerals. On the bridge, the radio operator, Pete Guillory, tunes a short-wave set and chuckles at an American commercial jingle that cuts through static and the hum of the generator. Below, stokers tend the boilers, their arms bare and working despite the chill. The boilers thrum at 200 revolutions per minute, steady and relentless. The harbour pilot nods once to Hayes and steps ashore under the amber street lamps, his silhouette swallowed by the curve of the jetty. Across town, lookouts on the lighthouse at Montauk sample the night with binoculars, noting ships' lights as if cataloguing stars. No blackout is enforced. Windows remain luminous. Advertisements glow, and pleasure boats drift lazily like moths near the piers. The confidence that everything here is domestic warps the horizon into complacency. No one imagined this would become a battlefield so close to home. The coast goes to sleep unguarded. Dancers slow, a trumpet solo fading into applause while men with grease under their nails still walk past nightclub doors toward the docks. The Cornelia May slips her moorings at dawn, the capstan groaning as lines are hauled, the engine telegraph clicking from stop to ahead. Hayes scans the skyline once more, then orders the engine room to bring the RPM up to 12 knots. He prefers day runs where ports are visible and schedules respected. On shore, a Coast Guard cutter idles at the outer buoy, crew leaning against the rail smoking, more a watchful neighbour than a fortress. Radio chatter is light, weather bulletins, schedules, occasional private voices, nothing of urgency. Family men kiss foreheads on gangplanks, children wave until faces blur into the harbour mists. The normal sequence of departure proceeds as it always has, each motion training the eyes away from danger. Yet beneath this choreography of commerce, invisible contours of strategy are forming, lanes where ships will axially align, lights that will draw attention like a hearth. What they didn't yet know was that the sea's predators preferred precisely this kind of predictable gleam. Night returns and the city shines even more insistently. Windows become lanterns, streets turn to ribbons of light, and the ocean reflects every neon sign as though the sea itself were made of glass. In a hotel suite, an admiral's aide dismisses a telegram with a careless thumb. No immediate threat, he writes, while downstairs waiters clear away the remains of cocktails and the band readies a slower number. The skyline is a map of prosperity and a promise of protection that does not exist. Harbour, lights outline freighters that move like constellations charted for convenience rather than concealment. A tugboat skipper steers with confidence, noting the exact position of the tankers by the beacon at Gravesend. His depth gauge reads 15 fathoms and he trusts it implicitly. On the waterfront, fishermen cast nets under the glow, their silhouettes as timeless as the tide. The rhythm of commerce, loading, leaving, returning, gives everyone a sense of mastery over place. Yet the same lights that warm the shore also offer precise signatures to any hunter who knows how to read them from the dark. No one imagined this would become an advantage for an enemy who hunted by night. At the same time, the coast sparkled. Coastal listening posts measured oddities on the air, German-sounding voices drifting across frequencies, but dismissed as atmospheric scatter. A young radio technician in Norfolk, Jimmy Larkin, notes a peculiar call sign but files it under curiosities. His log will later reveal entry after entry of faint signals that went unread. Merchant captains exchange port gossip over supper. They speak of steel shortages, war bond drives, and rationing in tones of distant inconvenience rather than immediate threat. Mrs. Ross returns from the ballroom with a shawl, unaware that her city's lamp glow creates a perfect silhouette for an approaching periscope. The tankers, enormous and slow, swing at anchor with their deck lights still on, their silhouettes etched against moonlit water like sleeping beasts. Gulls wheel overhead, indifferent to geopolitical calculations. The cause is simple. Wartime bureaucracies did not yet believe the American coastline would be a target, and the effect is equally simple. Defenses were minimal, response times slow. What they didn't yet know was the economy of darkness that the enemy would exploit. A few well-placed torpedoes could undo entire supply chains. In the hours after midnight, radio rooms across coastal towns relay weather and shipping updates, but no alarms. The sirens are tests only, clipped and routine. At sea, the Cornelia May follows her plotted lane, the compass needle steady and indifferent. Engines humming at the conservative speed of 11 knots to conserve fuel. Hayes eats from a tin, the taste of beef and gravy doing nothing to settle his thoughts about the war's far front. The Coast Guard cutter, meanwhile, remains a silhouette in the outer dark, its searchlight pointed toward fishing nets, not enemy horizons. On board a tanker at anchor, the officer of the watch, Thomas Avery, sits reading a letter from home, unaware that one of his ship's runs will be interrupted by fire in a matter of weeks. The pattern is consistent and comforting. Coastal lights, open transmissions, minimal escort, an approach that seems efficient in peacetime but dangerous in war. The effect is that the ocean presents itself like an open book to those who have learned to read its margins. No one imagined this would become a nightly calculus of life and death along the eastern seaboard. Far from the ballroom and the pier, the camera cuts to a periscope slicing the black like a knife. A German eye records the coastline as if mapping human habitude. The U-boat commander notes the lights, the spacing of vessels, the careless comfort of a population that still believes distance saves them. He adjusts his bearings, eyes narrowing as he measures the gap between ships. His hand rests on the release of a plan that will feel instantaneous to those ashore. Back on the Cornelia May, the mate whistles a tune and notes the starboard beacon. He does not look for a shadow that will never be obvious until it is too late. On shore, the band finishes its set, and the ballroom empties in contentment, the dancers carrying little more than perfume and the day's gossip into the snow-lit streets. Each small human act, a ship's light left on, a radio transmission casually sent, has consequences when read from the wrong angle. Cause begets effect. Light draws the eye guides the torpedo. What they didn't yet know was that the sea below held calculating intent, patient and precise. Dawn approaches with a softness that belies the violence the day will bring. Gulls call and fishermen untie skiff lines, while the city's hotel porters sweep cigarette butts from the doorstep. Hayes stands on the bridge with a steaming mug and stares toward the horizon, as if he could will it into a different future. The harbor's depth sounders hum faintly, reading steady, reassuring, and they lull men into believing the waters are familiar friends rather than instruments of fate. The Coast Guard has yet to implement full blackout drills. Shopkeepers draw curtains reluctantly, fearful of scaring customers more than of saving lives. In 1,000 small decisions across this coast, inertia and routine have triumphed over precaution. The effect is a coastline that by night looks like a string of campfires, warm, visible, and irresistible to those who hunt in darkness. And as the camera lifts above the glittering city and slides outward to the deep, the narrator intones softly with dawning gravity. While the cities danced in light, the hunters watched from beneath the waves. A narrow slit of glass breached the ocean like a searching eye as the periscope rose, cutting the mirror-smooth Atlantic into two halves. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan held the hood of the scope between two gloved hands and watched the silhouette of a merchantman slide slowly across the night, her light still on, her profile outlined against the low cloud glow. Beneath him, the diesel engines idled at 5 knots while the electric motors hummed on battery. A sound that felt almost apologetic in the hush. On the bridge of the SS Cyclops, third mate Joseph Burke tightened his grip on the rail and squinted toward the water, thinking of his wife's last letter and the tiny hand-drawn heart in the corner. Hardigan's navigator whispered the range, 1,200 meters, and the torpedo calculations began. Speed, gyro angle, depth setting for a G7E electric, set to run straight and wakeless. The men below deck checked the firing circuit again, the relay clicking with an unnerving mechanical precision. Outside, stars glinted like distant beacons, oblivious to the geometry of violence being drawn on the surface. Someone aboard U-123 muttered a prayer without knowing if it was for success or mercy. The decision, once made, moved from thought into metal. The periscope withdrew like a satisfied predator. A dull pneumatic thud travelled through the hull, the torpedo leaving its tube and sliding into black water with a hiss of expelled air. On the Cyclops a splintering sound followed, a small shudder that men at the rail mistook for a heavy wave. Hardigan watched the wake on his instrument panel, noting the torpedo's steadiness, the way the dark line cut toward light like a blade toward flesh. The clock on the conning tower read 2:14. The night kept its breath. 37 seconds later there was a second impact, smaller, closer to the stern, and then the ocean answered with a groan that rolled through timber and steel. Men on the Cyclops shouted, stumbling in the dim soups and coffee sloshing from their cups as someone screamed for the captain. The emergency lights painted faces in a sudden, sick orange as smoke began to bloom on the fantail. Hardigan tightened his jaw and ordered the boat to dive to 10 meters. Heart steady but hands doing the work of men who could not unmake a single choice. Below in the torpedo room, a sailor pressed his forehead to the cold steel and waited. The sea had accepted its first offering. When the fire took hold, it did so with an almost theatrical swiftness, black smoke sowing itself into the night, tongues of flame licking the rigging and casting the water into molten copper. Lifeboats were loosened and lowered amid shouted instructions, the crew working with the mechanical calm of drilled habit, even as fear undercut their motions. On the U-123, men watched through the periscope aperture, the reflected fire turning their faces the color of iron. The Cyclops' radio crackled with static, then the strained voice of a wireless operator calling for assistance, his words punctured by the roar of burning fuel. In New York and on nearby Coast Guard stations the call came through. A sinking ship, coordinates uncertain, a night that had become a ledger of emergency. Captain Hayes, on a different freighter, turned his helm toward the reported position. By instinct, the engine telegraph thrown to full, Hardigan ordered the boat to patrol submerged at periscope depth, eyes on the horizon for escort vessels that might answer the distress call. The sea reflected the fire in a trembling, broken mirror and took no satisfaction beyond the mechanical fulfillment of a mission. What they didn't yet know was how that orange flare would change the country's sense of itself. On the burning deck, Chief Engineer Martin Lewis shoved a locker loose to make a raft, his knuckles raw but hands steady with a practiced urgency. A young deckhand named Tommy, soot streaking his face, helped lower a small boat and counted heads with the kind of blunt arithmetic that replaces thought in sudden peril. One by one the men left the Cyclops, their silhouettes small and single against the huge, consuming glare, each carrying a single personal thing, a locket, a scrap of photograph, a lighter that no longer mattered. The sea around them was an indifferent cradle, rocking the survivors, as if to remind them that the ocean's rules had not changed for human sorrow. Coast Guard cutters and tugboats converged, their searchlights slicing swaths through smoke. Men in dark uniforms threw lines and hauled shivering sailors aboard. In a hospital bright with emergency lamps, nurses wrapped blankets around trembling shoulders and offered tea that tasted faintly of despair and resolve. Family names were taken, inked into registers, lists that would become records, and then for some, only names on plaques. On board U-123, the crew watched until the flames fell beneath the horizon, and then turned away to the next task. The ocean does not wait. The human cost of a single torpedo had already filled telephone exchanges and living rooms alike. Dawn leaked slowly into the sky, and with it came the radio reports that severed illusion. A ship sunk off Long Island, survivors rescued, coordinates being confirmed. Newspapers in Manhattan folded headlines with a speed the press never needed for anything so immediate. An editor's hand smudged ink on a lid line, and then for the first time in months the morning ran images of burning oil on the Atlantic. At the docks, laborers paused in the morning, chill and listened to battery-powered radios, faces folding into the gravity of a new reality. The War Department's message traffic picked up. Teleprinters clicked as communications traced the outline of a problem that had migrated from distant seas to American shores. In Washington, a naval officer named Captain Wallace briefed a small, hurried council, his words clipped and efficient. The maps spread like open wounds on a table. The president's advisors received the news with a mixture of anger and disbelief that the Atlantic could be penetrated so far, so quickly, was both tactical failure and political danger. The effect was immediate. Coastlights would be questioned, convoy plans considered, and a nation's complacency would be catalogued. No one imagined this would become the kind of headline that forced policy to catch up with reality overnight. The first strike had become a catalyst. Panic and procedure braided together along the eastern seaboard, where there was fear. There were also orderly lines at docks and an urgent reissuing of watch assignments. The Coast Guard tightened patrols, vessels shifting from leisure watches to wartime vigilance, engines idling at readiness and depth charges loaded with a grim ceremoniousness. Port authorities ordered searchlights extinguished and began to draft blackout regulations, a small, visible surrender of comfort to necessity. Merchant captains received cables advising tighter convoying practices. Though the muscle memory of independent runs resisted the change, some protested the loss of speed and schedule while others recognized survival. Hardigan, watching the shoreline reports from the periscope's reflected news, allowed himself a rare wry smile and then refocused on patrols, aware that the cost of visibility had now increased. On the Cyclops, survivors penned accounts that would be retold at kitchens and committee hearings, their words laying claim to the night that had frightened a nation. Across radio waves and telephone lines, families sought names and found blank spaces that would be filled over the coming days with lists and condolence. Cause: one well-placed torpedo, produced a cascade of effect: immediate rescue, administrative panic, and the long machinery of strategic response. The night's fire had become both symbol and spur. In Berlin and Lorient, news of the strike reached command rooms where Dönitz and his staff tallied advantages and risks in the same breath. The success of U-123 was a proof of concept. The American coast could be struck with speed and surprise, unsettling supply lines and morale alike. German signals in the command net were crisp. Orders were drafted to capitalize on momentum and expand patrols southward toward the Gulf and Caribbean. Yet practicality tempered jubilation. Every attack that drew notice risked reprisal, and reprisal meant new Allied tactics and technologies. British intelligence, watching the ripple effects, moved to advise Washington with the kind of urgency that had defined their response to earlier Atlantic threats. The chessboard was shifting, with new pieces introduced on the American side: convoy escorts, increased air patrols, and the allocation of destroyers and corvettes to previously quiet waters. Hardigan and his men, for their part, recorded the evening with a mixture of professional satisfaction and the muted human reaction to taking lives in cold calculation. What they didn't yet know was how rapidly the Allies would adapt, or how the Atlantic would rearrange itself in response to a single night's proclamation. The first strike had rewritten the map of assumption. Morning settled finally over the charred black of sea where the Cyclops had burned, and with it came a sober, reluctant resolve on both sides of the fight. Survivors spoke in staccato fragments that would be stitched into testimony. Commanders on both coasts began to redraw patrol patterns and blackout plans, with the mechanical focus of men who understand logistics as life and death. Newspapers kept the image of the orange horizon for days, a photograph that would haunt public memory and galvanize naval planners in equal measure. In small rooms across Long Island and beyond, mothers and fathers put away their evening dresses and returned to work with a new awareness that safety had thinned overnight. The U-boat officers would later write of the strike as a technical success, of angles and ranges. Yet in the quiet of their bunks there were also moments when the cost of victory softened the taste of triumph. The effect rippled outward, altering shipments, changing schedules, and compelling a nation to look seaward with a different, more fearful eye. And so, beneath the soft voice of a narrator, the evening closes on a simple, terrible image: fire on the water, and in that light a country waking to war's proximity. In a single flash of orange on the Atlantic, America's innocence burned away. A searchlight picked at the black like a curious hand as shoremen watched a shape burn beyond the breakers, and the smell of smoke rode the wind into town. On the bridge of a Coast Guard cutter, Lieutenant Frank Mallory barked orders while his engineer pushed the main engine to 15 knots, the turbines groaning as if they too felt the strain of the night. From the shoreline, civilians pointed and named smokestacks by town, as if cataloguing constellations, not knowing those lights would soon be memorials. In the water, small lifeboats bobbed like corks, their occupants wrapped in blankets or clinging to decking spacers with the dumb, animal terror of suddenly unmoored lives. Reports flowed into naval stations in half-phrased bursts: stern blown, survivors in the water, and teleprinters in regional offices clicked with the new, terrible normal of multiple sinkings. On U-123 and other boats in the pack, commanders logged successes in a ledger, their handwriting methodical and cold against the diesel-scented air. Men who had trained for months now stood watch under a sky that did not judge, only reflected flame. The sea accepted the damage in silence, carrying black fuel stains like bruises across its face. What they didn't yet realize was how public these nightly pyres would become, visible not only to mariners but to entire cities who had believed themselves safe. The coast was learning, violent, what it meant to be part of a war. The U-boats hunted with a grim economy, pick lanes where traffic concentrated, strike by night when lights and loneliness made targets, then melt back into the deep before escorts could form. Captain-Lieutenant Eric Topp reported similar tactics as he shadowed convoys, noting gyro angles and impact points. Each log made the next attack marginally more efficient. In the wardrooms of merchant ships, captains compared notes in hushed tones, their seafaring instinct now a ledger of vulnerability rather than pride. Tanker after tanker, collier after collier, fell to the same calculus. A torpedo at the stern, fires that ate through fuel and stores, then the slow, inevitable listing toward an unfriendly bed. On shore, telephone switchboards that had hummed with routine now rang endlessly with names, locations, and pleas. The press ran photographs of life rafts under moonlight, and families across New England and the mid-Atlantic began to learn the rhythm of waiting. The effect was both tactical and psychological. Shipping slowed, insurers raised premiums, and port timetables dissolved into contingency. No one imagined yet how this short season would cost hundreds of vessels and rearrange supply priorities. The hunt had become a strategy of attrition played out in coastal darkness. A fisherman named Salvatore Rossi pulled two men from an upturned raft near Cape Cod, their mouths tasting of seawater and fear, and later said only they were warm until they weren't. Nurses at a small Long Island clinic worked through wet clothing and fractured bones with the steady competence of people who see suffering as a daily carpenter sees splinters. Survivor testimony built a mosaic. Distant explosions felt like thunder, sudden lists that pinioned men beneath rails, and a cold so deep that even blankets seemed to rattle. In the wreckage, personal effects bobbed. A child's shoe, a ledger, a sailor's dog-eared Bible. Small evidence of ordinary lives reconstituted into stories for telegrams and funerals. On U-boat decks, men smoked in silence, sometimes exchanging a few words about the weather or the shot itself, reframing destruction as the fulfillment of orders and training. The dual perspectives were stark. For one set, the sea had become a lethal instrument. For the other, an indifferent machine of operational success. What they didn't yet know on either side was how these human traces would inflame public opinion, fueling demands in Washington for immediate and forceful response. Each survivor's detail made the campaign less abstract and the political cost of inaction more acute. The horror once recorded could not be unmade. In Washington, naval intelligence rooms filled with officers rubbing stubble and urgency, as maps were spread and red pins multiplied. The Chief of Naval Operations demanded explanations and actions in a voice that left little room for delay. Convoy doctrine, long the backbone of Atlantic defense, was hurriedly adapted to coastal runs where schedules and commerce had previously been uncoordinated. Destroyer captains were ordered south and east, patrol aircraft redirected on long, uncomfortable sorties that pushed engines and crews to their limits, and blimps once considered parlor. Curiosities were pressed into anti-submarine observation. On the docks, men who had always worked on manifest sheets learned to load for blackout runs, lights out, sparse deck illumination, and strict radio silence. The logistics of screening convoys inshore were complicated by port congestion and the insufficient numbers of escort vessels available across a vast coastline. Politicians in Congress demanded quick answers. Naval planners produced lists and timetables that read like attempts to patch an ocean with paper. The immediate effect was confusion growing into organized resistance. a costly, hurried mobilization that would soon yield improvements, but not before more lives were at stake. No one imagined the learning curve would be measured in burned ships and grieving towns. The Navy's scramble was both a reaction and a promise to make the coast less vulnerable at whatever cost. The campaign continued with a grim regularity: radarless nights, torpedo-wakeless approaches, and explosions that brightened the horizon like distant fireworks gone wrong. Communities along the coast began to mark the nights. Some families would not sleep, keeping vigil by battery radios for word of nearby disasters. In ports, congregated crews swapped rumors about which U-boats were nearest, trading names like U-123, U-66, and U-552 as if they were characters in a dangerous folktale. On board U-66, Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartwig logged a night of 3 attacks, noting that the first struck a tanker's boiler room, the second broke a freighter's keel, and the third missed by mere meters. Each success translated into real, immediate shortages ashore: heating oil delayed, cargoes lost, store shelves emptied of goods that took weeks to replace. The economic ripple became tangible. Merchants calculated losses, insurance underwriters revised rates, and communities prepared for rationing that felt suddenly close and practical. The effect tightened like a noose around coastal supply chains and daily life. What they didn't yet understand fully was how the summer's escalating pattern would force not just tactical, but industrial and societal adjustments across the eastern seaboard. Photographers tried to capture the spectacle with a sober eye. Black and white frames of burning tankers were printed in papers with captions that read like epitaphs. One image, a lifeboat crowded with damp men, faces drawn and pale under a single lamp, became a haunting emblem in city newspapers, carried into living rooms across the nation. Volunteer rescue crews learned to operate in darkness, their small boats threaded through oil-slick water while the acrid stench of burning fuel stung their throats. On observation towers, volunteers with binoculars and coffee waited for silhouettes to rise and report to the nearest station. Their hands grew steady with practice, even as their stomachs knotted with dread. U-boat captains logged these nights with clinical detail: angle on target, range, torpedo depth settings, the same technical notes that would later be studied in training rooms and debriefs. The duality was always present: a sailor's technical note and a mother's wail on the shore. The cause was tactical success. The effect was cultural trauma, an image-based memory that would persist in the national consciousness. No one imagined the texture of this grief would be so visual, that Fire on the Water could be reprinted, cached, and revisited in homes for decades to come. The Navy began to field immediate countermeasures: shallow water sonar sweeps from converted trawlers, aircraft fitted with depth charges flew low and slow, searching the slick, and convoys were shepherded with a new seriousness. New doctrines emerged in real time: zigzagging patterns to complicate torpedo solves, blackout enforcement along coastlines, and concentrated escort schedules for particularly vulnerable routes. Engineers worked feverishly to improve. Detectors. A young technician in a Brooklyn shipyard recalibrated a hydrophone array that would later catch the whisper of screws from a submerged U-boat. Yet technology takes time, and crews take training. The first weeks of response were earnest but imperfect, and losses continued even as defenses improved. Commanders on both sides measured adjustments and counter-adjustments in a grim arithmetic of lives and ships. What they didn't yet know was how decisive Allied air cover and sonar improvement would become in the months to come, nor how logistics and production could eventually overwhelm tactical ingenuity at sea. For now, Adaptation meant improvisation and courage. Captains learned to read the ocean in a new key, and crews learned to live with the constant risk of disappearance. As winter moved toward spring, the coastline itself seemed altered. Dockside laughter grew quieter, memorial services multiplied, and the nightly horizon acquired an edge of wary respect. Communities hung service flags, and men who had once stood at piers smiling were now enlisted in patrols or handed tidal duty rosters that made them feel at once important and fragile. On U-boat charts, commanders recorded success and movement with the precise detachment of those who have traded blood for strategy. In coastal town halls, names were read aloud, and requiem services were planned with municipal solemnity. The campaign had exacted a human toll visible not only in cold statistics, but in infant graves, emptied rooms, and the long, quiet letters sent from sea to shore. The ocean had become a graveyard lit by fire, a phrase that would recur in telegrams and memoirs alike, tying together the tactical and the tragic. The effect on national policy was unmistakable. Resources would be redirected, technologies accelerated, and an entire doctrine of coastal defense would be reborn in the wake of flame. And in the hush that came after another night of burning, the narrator's voice would close the chapter with a simple, deliberate chord of sorrow and understanding. The ocean had become a graveyard lit by fire. It began with the tide. Along the Carolina coast, fishermen walking the beach at dawn found wreckage tangled in seaweed, a broken lifeboat, a life jacket, a child's wooden toy. The Atlantic had returned its evidence quietly, as if it wanted to be sure someone was watching. Sheriff Albert Harlan stood ankle-deep in surf beside a nameplate that once belonged to the Alcoa Guide, its letters scorched and salt-worn. By noon, word had traveled through Wilmington's main street faster than any official bulletin. Another ship gone, another crew vanished. In a diner near the pier, families gathered around a table radio, the static interlaced with news of enemy submarines sighted off Cape Hatteras. A woman covered her son's ears as an announcer listed new sinkings, but the boy had already learned the names. The local harbor froze in indecision. Ships stayed moored, engines cold, crews unsure whether to sail or wait. At the Coast Guard station, men in oilskins stared at a growing line of wreck coordinates plotted across their wall map. The rhythm of life along the coast, fish markets, ferry runs, night dances began to falter. What they didn't yet know was that fear itself would soon spread faster than the fire at sea. Inside a wooden shack perched on a sand dune, radio operator Mary Ellen Price adjusted her headset and listened for distress calls, bleeding through the static. Her logbook already listed 6 confirmed sinkings that week, each with approximate time and coordinates, though none officially confirmed by Washington. The night before, she'd caught fragments of an SOS, torpedo south deck gone, help. Before it dissolved into silence, she looked at the shoreline through her window and could almost imagine periscopes watching her back. Inland, rumors multiplied with the same unchecked rhythm. Submarines spotted in rivers, saboteurs walking through dunes, spies disguised as fishermen. The Navy's public bulletins were calm, cautious, and increasingly ignored. Telephone operators found themselves repeating the same reassurance. Yes, the Navy's aware. No, they're not near you. At the airfield, a small reconnaissance plane idled with its engine sputtering, waiting for orders that didn't come. The official message was still restraint. The public feeling was already hysteria. No one imagined this panic would paralyze the coast more effectively than any blockade. Farther north, along the Jersey shore, civilian volunteers climbed observation towers built from salvaged lumber and optimism. They scanned the horizon through cheap binoculars, every shadow a potential conning tower, every breaking wave a suspicion. 17-year-old Daniel Reeves recorded his first definite sighting in a spiral notebook at 2:40 p. Munning convinced he'd seen a periscope off Barnegat Light. The report reached a Navy substation, was logged, and politely ignored, another entry in a swelling tide of false alarms. Patrol boats set out anyway, their engines coughing against the surf, leaving behind wives who watched from piers until they were no longer visible. The Coast Guard's cutters burned fuel at a rate no supply depot could sustain, sweeping the same empty waters night after night. By week's end, the shoreline from Maine to Florida was alive with eyes and empty of sleep. What they didn't yet realize was that their vigilance, however flawed, was reshaping the nation's relationship to its own geography. For the first time since the Revolution, Americans feared their coastline. By February, panic had become an industry. Newspapers sold out before noon, their front pages filled with grainy photographs of oil fires and lifeboats. Radio commentators speculated openly about enemy landings, and rumor became indistinguishable from intelligence. In Norfolk, a warehouse owner swore he'd seen lights signaling from the dunes. By nightfall, 10 different towns reported the same phantom. Children traded stories in schoolyards. German spies with binoculars, periscopes disguised as driftwood, U-boats that surfaced to buy fuel from fishing boats. Clergymen held prayer meetings for coastal protection, their congregations filling pews with the same quiet dread that once belonged to hurricane seasons. Merchants boarded windows not against wind but against invasion. In Washington, officials debated censorship while public anxiety expanded beyond control. What they didn't yet know was that the U-boats thrived on that uncertainty. Each rumor slowed traffic, halted shipments, and made the coastline its own prisoner. The docks fell silent. Where once cranes clattered and winches squealed, now there was only the echo of seagulls and the lap of tide against pilings. Cargo lay untouched in warehouses because no crew would sign for passage. The merchant marine unions debated striking until better protection was promised. The Navy responded with reassurances it couldn't yet fulfill. Captain Harold Mason, 40 years at sea, stood beside his tied-up freighter and muttered, "I never thought fear could sink more ships than torpedoes." Along the Gulf, tankers anchored in port, their decks shimmering with idle heat, while naval patrols buzzed overhead with empty fuel tanks and full uncertainty. The economy slowed as transport choked, and letters from stranded sailors piled in post offices waiting for direction. Inland factories worked overtime to produce war, materials that now had nowhere to go. The cause was invisible. A few submarines prowling offshore. The effect was an entire nation's arteries seizing up. No one imagined that such stillness could feel so loud. Aboard the destroyer USS Jacob Jones, seaman first class, Everett Cole stood his midnight watch, binoculars glued to the waves that looked identical in every direction. His ship had been tasked to patrol the Delaware Capes, a monotonous route of grey days and darker nights. In the sonar room, operators strained to hear pings over the hum of the engines, marking false contacts more often than real ones. Every depth charge dropped was both an act of defense and a confession of uncertainty. On land, radar operators faced their own ghosts, blips that vanished before officers could confirm them, waves of interference mistaken for fleets. The psychological weight was cumulative. Every sound in the night became a warning. Commanders began to understand that nerves like equipment could fail under continuous use. What they didn't yet know was that this unseen stress would soon cost them ships, not from attack, but from the errors born of exhaustion. The war was changing shape, from fire and explosions to silence and paranoia. At 3:17 a.m. one night in early March, a faint transmission broke through on coastal frequency, a merchant vessel's final words before vanishing. Engine room gone, abandoning ship, coordinates. Then nothing but the sound of static and surf in Wilmington. Mary Ellen Price noted the entry and folded her hands, knowing there would be another by dawn. In New York, newsrooms scrambled to confirm details, while editors debated whether publishing would help or harm morale. The radio network softened language, calling it a maritime setback, as though fire, oil, and loss could be contained by phrasing. But every listener understood. Families sitting around their living rooms heard something older than news, the sound of war breathing at their doorstep. What they didn't yet know was that these signals were not the last. Farther south, more distress calls were already being drafted in salt and smoke. The U-boats were moving, undisturbed and unseen. Morning came grey and reluctant. Along the beaches of South Carolina, volunteers walked the tideline with notebooks, counting what the sea had returned overnight. Barrels, wreckage, and sometimes bodies. In the distance, a Navy patrol plane droned low, its shadow fleeting across the water like a ghost already. Too late. Fishermen hauled in nets and found pieces of lifeboats, ropes, boots with names stenciled on them. In diners, the coffee stayed hot, but conversations grew colder, turning each headline into a memorial. The coastal watchtowers still stood, but the men inside had stopped calling out every sighting. They simply stared, resigned to what they could not prevent. Fear had become a routine, a background hum behind every task, every wave. And as the narrator's voice falls to quiet, each dawn revealed another wreck, another whispered name lost to the sea. The hatch slammed, and that single metallic report folded into the submarine's small world like a verdict. Chief Engineer Carl Schutzer wiped grease from his hands and listened to the diesel's low, patient thrum through the hull. Above them, the sea showed no mood, flat, indifferent, a black sheet under moonlight, while inside the boat the air grew thick and sweet with sweat. A young seaman hummed a hymn under his breath to steady his hands as he tightened a bolt on the torpedo rack. The conning tower's pressure gauge ticked in the corner, needles dancing in a tiny, relentless choreography that measured life beneath the waves. Captain Ranhard Hardigan moved between stations with the deliberate calm of a man who knows panic must be rationed. He read aloud the patrol order one more time, voice low, so the words landed without drama. Sweep the coast, attack at night, evade at dawn. The men responded with the clipped sounds of competence, acknowledgements, the slap of palms, the soft clank of tools returned to their racks. Outside, the engines shifted smoothly from diesel to electric. The boat's heartbeat changed pitch and made the metal around them sing. In this small, condensed world, every sound was magnified into consequence, and time itself began to stretch thin. Watches rotated like clockwork, 2 men at the periscope, 2 on the helm, 2 in the engine room, and the rest in various states of controlled sleep. Sleep was fragmented, measured in 15-minute nods, with dreams that dissolved the instant a pressure alarm squealed. The galley produced the same tins of stew and black coffee, and the taste was memory, not meal. Men smoked in the red light of the mess until the cigarettes were reduced to the bitter but familiar nub. Charts were refolded a dozen times, pencil marks pressed into creases like scars of decisions already made. The Enigma machine rattled in the radio room, symbols turning into orders that would arrive as destiny on another hull. A lookout, Oberbootsman Müller, kept a small carved wooden ship in his pocket. With a habit, he said, kept frost from his fingers. They kept themselves busy with maintenance, with jokes that landed flat, with prayers whispered to no god in particular. Night after night, this routine built a buffer against fear, but it also concealed the deep erosion of morale that came from being constantly watched by the sea. What they didn't yet know was how long the ocean could wear a man down before it demanded something of him he could not give. The faint percussion of distant depth charges arrived like distant drums muffled through tons of water and steel. Each charge sent a shudder through the hull that translated into a language only these men knew: hold, brace, wait. Inside the control room, the hydrophone operator cupped his ear to the stethoscope and traced the echo patterns with a pencil. When the pings matched known depths and intervals, the men catalogued them and adjusted trim and depth by meters, not by guesswork. A small leak under the boiler room demanded constant attention. A patch of canvas and resin became as precious as a ration of bread. The compressor cycled, refilling tanks that would growl like metallic bellows when the electric motors needed a burst of speed. In tight quarters, tempers flared over trivial slights and then cooled with the same speed. Like measures of breath returned, letters home were folded, refolded, and sometimes burned to save weight. Burned with an intimacy that made the smoke taste of memory. The psychological map of the boat was drafted in the angles men avoided to keep from remembering faces of friends lost earlier at sea. Beneath the technical routines and quiet repairs, a slow, claustrophobic pressure gathered that could not be fixed with tools alone. When calm settled, boredom arrived with its own cruel efficiency. Men played cards under dim red lamps and argued about football scores long since irrelevant. At other moments, terror flashed, a sonar blip, a radio burst, the sighting of a convoy in the wrong light, and the mood snapped taut like wire. Each drill was precise. Crash dive to 60 meters in 90 seconds, vents secured, batteries switched to silent running. Men locked into stations with the discipline of monks. They practiced surfacing in fog, firing torpedoes at calculated gyro angles, and cutting engines with the expert touch of mechanics who had learned to treat silence as armor. The boat's logbook recorded these drills in cold numerals that could later be read for praise or for inquiry: times, depths, battery voltages, and engine RPM. In the spare minutes, sailors sharpened tools, wrote crude sketches on bulkheads, or argued about whether a schnapps ration was deserved after a successful patrol. The cabin air tasted of metal and medicines, of unwashed bodies and peppermint lozenges, crushed to soothe sore throats. Hardigan walked the narrow corridors like a surgeon comforting a ward, his presence a steadying geometry in cramped chaos. No one imagined this would become a life described more in repairs and rotations than in names at home, more in maintenance logs than in letters returned. Yet slowly, inexorably, the routine became the story they told themselves to survive. The men built micro-communities within the boat, a knot of smokers who swapped pills, a chess pair who kept score, a small chorus for the rare hymn at dawn. They marked birthdays with the meagerest of privileges: an extra orange slice, a bottle of watered schnapps passed in silence. In the torpedo room, boatswain Franz Keller polished brass fittings and spoke of a daughter he'd not seen for 2 years, his voice steady as metal under polish. Laughter could break out at the least expected moment. A crude joke, a misread order, a card game victory, and for a minute the steel walls returned to being a ship, not a coffin. Letters brought news, births, promotions, a neighbor's funeral, and each name folded into that small society became another weight to carry. The boat's nurses tended scraped knees and the occasional fever with iodine and steady hands, improvising remedies from sparse medical kits. When night fell and the sea smoothed, men sat on the deck under a thin, cold sky and tried to forget the tally of sinkings they'd contributed to. Some wrote future plans, others counted the days until rotation back to port. All of them measured the patrol in small certainties: fuel levels, battery charge, food stores. Hardigan understood that morale was as fragile as a battery cell. A mismanaged rumour could drain it as surely as a parasite sapping power. They had yet to learn how quickly improved Allied tactics would turn their small routines into desperate gambits. Engines hummed in sustained monotones, diesels at cruising RPM that siphoned fuel like breath, and electric motors humming at low amps while surfaced to conserve battery banks. The gauges on the control panel glowed a sickly green. The battery banks sometimes registered 110 volts or less after heavy maneuvers, and men watched those numbers like prayers. Air quality became a battleground. CO weather levels crept up in long dives, musty and thick, prompting periodic ventilation that could never fully clear the metallic tang. Men suffered nosebleeds, throats raw with salt and diesel, and the medic's little bottle of tablets dwindled faster. Each patrol leaks were a constant arithmetic. A slow drip meant labor and attention. A fast one meant real danger to the pressure equilibrium. At night, the hum of pumps and the click of relays were a lullaby as well as a warning, a soundtrack that digitized mortality into rhythm. Maintenance was relentless. Brushless motors greased, periscopes cleaned, gyro compasses recalibrated with fine adjustments until hands trembled. Conversation inside the boat turned to engineering. Which valve was bulky? Which seal needed replacement? Who could splice a cable if the radio failed? Because work kept fear at bay. The men spoke in voltages and pressures, because quantifiable problems had answers. Human fear did not. What they didn't yet know was that technological strain would soon be matched by strategic innovations above water that would undermine the very mechanical advantages they prized. In quiet hours, sailors confessed fears to one another beneath blankets, voices low, so the steel would not hear and carry their shame. Some told stories of home as if repeating them could summon the smell of coffee or the sound of a child's laugh into the hum of the boat. Others grew taciturn, staring at the bulkhead as if it contained maps to a future they could not reach. Hardigan sometimes found himself reading the names of men on a roster and feeling them as more than ranks, as individuals who owed him a kind of paternal duty. Discipline remained strict, but compassion threaded through orders. Extra soup for a sick mate, a watch shortened for a man with a fever, a cigarette offered in silence to a trembling hand. At times a depth charge from a distant escort would reverberate, and the entire crew would move with practiced choreography, each man knowing his precise role in a rescue or an evasion. There were moral conversations too, whispered and brief, about the faces in lifeboats, the screams they heard through night radios, on the weight of killing strangers to fulfill orders. The books in the officer's locker included novels and pamphlets on tactics, but also a slim volume of poetry passed down by a previous crew, dog-eared and stained with sweat. Those poems were read aloud sometimes, voices low and steady, bringing a human cadence to days measured in knots and depth. In the narrow corridors of steel, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Patrols dragged longer. The Allied escorts grew bolder as weeks passed, and their methods improved from clumsy to calculating. On a clear night, the silhouettes of distant aircraft traced slow arcs above the sea, their running lights inadequate against the dark, but their presence ominous to any commander below. In the radio room, intercepted chatter suggested escort routes and new sonar patterns. The men compared these hints against their logs with a new wary attention. Torpedo crews found targets less numerous and more wary. Merchant ships running dark and hugging coasts with convoy escorts that did more than just mark a line on a map. Batteries drained faster in the sudden need to evade, and commanders ordered deeper dives, trading speed for stealth in a calculus that leaned ever toward endurance. A petty officer named Kruger muttered of tactics that once worked now creaking at the edges, and the conviction in his voice had the hollow ring of prophecy. The boat's routine of maintenance and monotony would not be enough. Something above had shifted the rules of their quiet game. What they didn't yet know was that these early adaptations would soon harden into doctrine. Radar sweeps, air coverage, and improved convoy discipline, turning the hunter into prey in ways they had only just begun to feel. For now the men kept their rituals, wrapped their fears in work, and kept their eyes on the periscope when it rose like the eye of a sleeping god. The transition had begun. American countermeasures were not immediate salvation, but they were the first fracture in the sea's long silence. The radio in the command center rasped as a fresh dispatch arrived, the paper ribbon from the teleprinter curling like a living thing under Lieutenant Commander James Calhoun's hand. He stood over a map table ringed with men in overcoats, thumbs tapping planned routes with the impatient rhythm of those who must act quickly. Admiral Ernest King's directives hung in the air, crisp and consequential, as officers argued whether to pull destroyers from Atlantic hunter-killer groups or to hold them for convoy screens. Charts were spread in lamplight, pencil lines traced in salt-stained hands, showing lanes of merchant traffic that could be gathered and protected. A junior intelligence analyst, Petty Officer Ruiz, pointed to coastal shipping densities and muttered estimations of tonnage lost per night, numbers that tasted like indictment. Somebody suggested blackout enforcement from Maine to Florida. Another officer argued for immediate aircraft patrols along the gap. Outside the window, rain ticked on the glass, as if time itself were urging haste. The room had turned from a planning table into a crucible of decisions that would reshape supply and survival. What they didn't yet know was how quickly organization could move from memos to ships. The effect of that day's argument would be convoys, imperfect, dangerous but necessary. By dawn, the first coastal convoys began to assemble. Merchant men eased into formation like reluctant geese, their funnels smoking and their decks stripped of casual light. Captain Harold Mason, now assigned to lead one such convoy, barked orders across the bridge of the moraine. Engines kept at a conservative 12 knots to match the slowest freighter, escort vessels, Clemson-class destroyers, converted Coast Guard cutters, and hastily armed trawlers took up stations, their sonar operators checking hydrophones and depth charge racks being secured and double-checked. The effect was immediate at the dockside. A new discipline of blackout drapes, shielded lights, and sealed portholes as shore teams learned the small but essential choreography of dusk. On the radio, terse signals confirmed departure times and rendezvous points. The telegraph's clack was now a metronome of purpose. Men who had been used to independent runs learned to accept the safety of numbers, trading speed for mutual defense. Back in the planning room, officers annotated the map, routes, timings, fuel calculations, and the nearest airstrip for emergency dispatch. No one imagined this would become a long-term reality, but necessity hardened into practice quickly. The coastline's old rhythms would bend into convoy discipline before summer's end. Along a midnight sea lane, A converted trawler's crew drilled, dropping depth charges at intervals refined by hydrophone triangulation, the detonations punching the water and sending tremors through the hull of nearby vessels. Petty Officer Langley supervised the pattern, 20-meter spreads, runs of 120 meters, and careful timing to avoid friendly damage. Technique learned and relearned under the hard light of urgency. Naval aviators practiced low-altitude bombing runs from Catalinas and Hudsons, engines whining at calibrated RPMs before the glide, the crews timing their approach to match the speed and echo of sonar bearings. Sonar operators, young men whose ears had become instruments, reported improved detection of screw signatures at slow speeds, a small but meaningful advance. Onshore mechanics hustled to refit older hulls with hedgehog mortars and hydrophones, converting fishing trawlers and tugs into something like teeth in a coastal defense. The effect was twofold: immediate capability and a morale boost for crews who felt less like sitting ducks and more like a nervous, learning community. What they didn't yet know was how quickly these ad hoc innovations would scale into doctrine that reshaped U-boat calculations. The first tangible counterpunch had been thrown, measured in exercises, and the precise geometry of explosive arcs. At sea, captains once skeptical of convoys began to understand their calculus. A single U-boat could still strike, but not without paying greater risk to itself when met by escorts. Captain Samuel Hayes, once an advocate of independent runs, kept a close eye on the horizon as his freighter steamed in company with 8 others under escort, the deck crew moving with mechanical confidence that had been absent before. The merchant convoy's ordered passage showed the political effect immediately. Insurance rates stabilized marginally, shipping agents regained a sliver of confidence, and cargo that had sat idle in warehouses began moving again. On the bridge, lookouts scanned with renewed purpose, their binoculars registering the silhouettes of escort, wakes as comforts rather than threats. Families ashore breathed a little easier at the sight of disciplined columns moving offshore, though the risk remained. Concentrated targets attract attention. The cause and effect were plain. Organized movement reduced vulnerability at the cost of speed and flexibility. No one imagined yet that convoys would also force the enemy to adapt strategy and disperse its limited assets. The coastline was discovering that defense required not only men and ships, but strict, sometimes unpopular habit. The nervous lifeblood of the new system was communication encrypted orders, radio silence windows, and prearranged signal changes that kept convoys from broadcasting their courses. In a cramped radio room, Ensign Bradley keyed a coded message to a distant escort, his fingers steady though the stakes were high. Reveal too much, and you invite death. Reveal too little, and you lose cohesion. Coastal command centers set up relay points, tying aircraft strips to naval signals so that patrols could be vectored to last known attack positions with minutes to spare. Port signalmen learned semaphore and blackout protocols, and municipal police departments were pressed into service enforcing curfews and dim-outs on quiet coastal streets. The immediate effect was less glamorous than a single dramatic hunt. It was hours shaved off response times, fewer false sightings, and tighter protection around hub ports. Technicians adjusted radios for frequency hopping and shortened transmission bursts to reduce interception risk. A new language of brevity and discipline spread. What they didn't yet know was how central this web of communication would become to later convoy success in the mid-Atlantic, where air cover would matter far more than a single coastal cutter. For now, coherence was protection, and the lines of command had become lifelines. The first true test came on a moonless night, when a convoy of 10 merchant ships, escorted by 2 destroyers and a single patrol bomber, made a planned inshore run and encountered a shadow that moved too cleanly to be a whale. The destroyer's sonar operator reported a faint screw signature at 500 meters, and within minutes hedgehogs were readied and the first pattern launched into the deep. The thuds felt like an answering drumbeat. Men below decks waited with methodical terror. The convoy tightened its formation by subtle helm adjustments as practiced, and the patrol bomber circled for a closer look before signaling back to base. The result was inconclusive. No confirmed kill that night, but the psychological effect was immediate. A U-boat that had once slipped in and out of reach now found itself traced and pressured. On board the convoy, morale steadied and the captain learned to trust procedure more than superstition. Washington received the after-action report with cautious approval. Small victories, the message suggested, would compound into strategic advantage. No one imagined that such incremental pressure would eventually force U-boats to shift to riskier tactics. The tide of the campaign had begun to feel for the first time like something that could be pushed back. As convoys proved their worth in skirmishes, politicians in Washington redirected industrial efforts to speed improvements. More escorts were commissioned, sonar research was funded, and training programs multiplied in naval yards. Senators pressed for immediate action, and appropriations committees found the language to fund ships that months earlier had seemed too costly. The effect moved from tactical to structural. Shipyards increased keel laying, crews were trained at accelerated rates, and coastal air bases enlarged their ranges and hangars for long-endurance patrols. For coastal communities, this influx of resources meant jobs and the arrogance of purpose replacing the paralysis of fear. Yet with resources came new logistical problems: escort allocation, crew fatigue, and supply lines stretched thin across multiple theaters. What they didn't yet know was how long it would take for production and training to translate into decisive numerical superiority at sea. Still, the psychological transformation was visible. A nation that had been reactive was beginning to act with coordinated intent. Resolve hardened into policy, and policy into the machinery of defense. On a calm spring morning several weeks after the first coastal convoys formed, a harbor lighthouse keeper saw escort wakes heading out in disciplined rows and allowed himself a small private sigh of relief. Families at the pier watched columns of ships slide offshore in ordered silence, and radio programming shifted from panic to cautious optimism as commentary acknowledged the new measures. Command rooms across the eastern seaboard kept tally: fewer unescorted sailings, improved response times, more air coverage in vulnerable stretches, and a nascent doctrine for coastal protection. U-boat commanders in Lorient and Brest read reports with narrowed eyes and began to rethink the cost-benefit of easy coastal strikes. The tactical effect was beginning to accumulate into strategic consequence. Protection reduced the hit rate, and the enemy's freedom to choose targets diminished. No one imagined this would be an overnight fix. The cost had already been paid in ships and lives, but the first fractures in the U-boat campaign were visible, and as the narrator draws breath and the image fades to convoy wakes, dissolving into morning mist, the final line closes the chapter with a note of resolute relief. At last, the coast began to fight back. The map table swam in lamplight as signals traffic slid across the teleprinter ribbon, each clack a small command. In Lorient's U-boat command bunker, officers bent over casualty lists, names folded against iron numbers and dates. Admiral Karl Dönitz stood with his hand on the edge of the table, face lit by a pool of light that made his eyes appear even colder. Reports came in, U-boat losses rising along the American coast, escorts more numerous, air patrols pushing their reach. He listened, then tapped a cigarette into an ashtray without smoking it. The movement, a practiced ritual of consideration. Staff officers argued tactics. Remain aggressive on the east coast or disperse to less defended waters. Voices low but urgent. Signals from Bletchley Park and intercepted traffic suggested the Allies were learning faster than anticipated, tightening the noose around easy prey. Dönitz weighed tonnage lost against tonnage gained, and saw that momentum favored audacity but demanded discretion. He issued a terse order to reroute certain flotillas, instructing commanders to seek targets where predators might find fattier game. The room exhaled a mixture of resolve and the quiet doubt that accompanies any strategic turn. Within days, orders were relayed to pen commanders and captains like Reinhard Hardigan and Eric Topp, their boats retasked for longer passages. U-boat crews packed extra fuel cans and spare parts, adapting hull maintenance schedules for extended tropical humidity they had not trained for. Technicians tweaked hydroplanes and venting systems to cope with warmer water and different thermal layers that altered sonar returns. Naval architects back in dockyards calculated consumables per patrol, pushing endurance numbers in blotched handwriting across manifest forms. Lorient's dry docks emptied as pens prepared for patrols to the Azores, Canary Currents, and ultimately the Caribbean approaches. Hardigan himself adjusted gyro settings for torpedoes to account for different sea temperatures that changed depth-keeping characteristics. The practicalities were simple but consequential. Longer runs meant more exposure, stretched supply lines, and crews facing heat and disease. What they didn't yet know was how a shift in latitude would shift strategy, not just where to hunt, but how to survive the hunt. Orders emphasized surprise, dispersed patrol patterns, and opportunistic attacks on solitary tankers and coastal traffic in the Gulf. The command believed a southern turn could restore the momentum they had begun to lose to Allied learning and industrial scale. Across the Atlantic, signals intelligence picked up the movements, and Allied codebreakers noted the pattern with clinical attention. At Bletchley Park, analysts marked the redeployment of the wolf packs on charts. Gloves off, hands stained with ink and late-night tea. American naval intelligence, newly supplied with British insight, compiled fresh warnings for Caribbean commands and Gulf ports. Admiral King convened conference calls with Caribbean air commanders, their voices mapping patrol ranges and tanker routes over static. At Trinidad and Curacao, air crews readied Catalinas and Hudsons for patrols that would need to fly hours longer than before. Engines run at economy RPM to preserve range. Planes were loaded with depth charges calibrated for shallow coastal shelves and with extra fuel bladders for endurance. The effect was immediate. Aircraft range lines extended seaward and coordination with naval escorts tightened along newly vulnerable lanes. No one imagined this would become a theater of such improvisation, where cargoes, refineries and neutral waters intertwined into a dangerous mosaic. Allied planners scrambled convoys southward and revised routing to stagger departures and reduce singleton targets. The chessboard expanded, each move provoking countermoves that would stretch both strategy and supply. In German pens, Dönitz watched the reports with an expression that suggested both calculation and fatigue. His staff whispering updates at his elbow, he authorized select commanders to push into the Gulf Stream's warmer embrace, seeking the thin edges of Allied defenses. Kapitän-Leutnant Topp took his U-552 into the western approaches, noticing the change in sea color and the sheen of tropical oil on the surface. Men who had endured North Atlantic gales now complained of heat settling in the hull like an unwelcome guest, of mosquitoes, and the smell of diesel warmed to the point of tang. On deck, sundown no longer meant immediate relief. The humidity made clothing cling and sleep, an elusive luxury. The practical changes forced commanders to rethink patrol rotations, often shortening them to reduce health risks among crews. What they didn't yet know was how Allied logistical reach, air bases, escort construction and local intelligence would blunt these tactical gambits. Still, the prospect of crippled refineries and vulnerable tankers gleamed like promise in the logbooks of the commanders who hoped to starve Allied fleets of fuel. Every plotted route carried with it the possibility of large payoff and sudden, lethal cost. Determination and doubt sat side by side in the command bunker like uneasy allies. On the ground in the Caribbean, dockworkers watched German activity on foreign dispatches with a mix of curiosity and alarm. In Port of Spain, sailors and oilmen briefed on blackout procedures and watch rotations, the refinery managers tallying potential losses in tons of fuel per week. Ships began to travel in looser convoys or to hug shorelines under neutral flags, hoping that proximity to land would deter attack. Those tactics sometimes worked, but often simply changed the type of vulnerability. Coastal traffic invited closer engagement and shallower water hazards. U-boats learned to lurk in channels and at choke points where tankers must pass for bunkering or loading, converting distance into opportunity. American coast watchers in Florida, Texas were briefed to report discreetly, to avoid panic while providing precise coordinates for any suspicious activity. The consequence for local populations was palpable: an increase in convoy traffic, more frequent air patrols, and a sense that war had moved from maps to their beaches. No one imagined the geopolitical consequences. Neutral waters, colonial outposts, and commercial ports would all be drawn into a contest, neither built for nor expecting it. Supply lines extended, and so did the reach of both danger and command. The theatre had broadened, and commanders on both sides felt the strain of longer commitments. Back in Lorient, message runners brought word of sinkings in the Caribbean that tasted of both triumph and caution on the commanders' tongues. U-boat logs recorded large tankers hit off Trinidad and the Lesser Antilles, victories that promised strategic disruption if they could be repeated. Signal traffic, however, also carried the names of boats that failed to return, a constant reminder that daring carried cost. The men toasted quietly in cramped messes when a patrol returned with prize and body counts, tallied in ledger margins. Technicians filed reports on tropical corrosion that required new seals and maintenance schedules, feeding dockyard lists that would take months to remedy. Allied countermeasures were evolving too. Local naval commands created hunter-killer groups that combined air and sea assets, with a speed that surprised German staff. What they didn't yet know was how much Allied industrial depth and imperial reach would matter, how bases in Bermuda, the Azores, and West Africa would eventually constrict U-boat options. Tactical gains in the Caribbean bought time and resources, but also drew enemy attention and counterforce in a geography that favored defenders in the long term. For the commanders, each success required a calculation. Take the prize or withdraw before the tide of response set in. The wolf packs were reconstituted for a new arc of operations, aggressive but haunted by the price of exposure. Across intelligence rooms, analysts on both sides tracked weather patterns, currents, and shipping manifests with renewed intensity, aware that natural phenomena could become tactical assets. The Gulf's shallow shells altered sonar performance. Thermal layers in warm water masked screw noise that once gave away a submarine's approach. German engineers debated torpedo depth settings and magnetic exploder adjustments to account for different salinities and hull types, common in tankers. Allied acoustic researchers, in turn, experimented with hydrophone arrays deployed on buoys around choke points to better triangulate underwater noise. The duel of adaptation moved faster than any single engagement. Each side's tweak produced a counter-move within weeks rather than months. No one imagined this would become a war of constant technical iteration, where a single calibration could decide a ship's fate. On the bridge of a U-boat, a petty officer compared notes with a captured log he'd read in port about the changes to escort patterns and air refueling capabilities. He realized with a small private panic that every advantage that the U-boat sought demanded more than daring. It demanded sustainable logistics. The operational theater's expansion to warmer waters had the paradoxical effect of opening new opportunities, while exposing the Kriegsmarine's logistical limits. Determination thus carried a new contour, boldness, tempered by the knowledge that resources, not courage alone, would shape long-term success. As spring gave way to early summer, the redeployed wolf packs hunted along the Gulf Stream and around key refineries, their wake a thin, dark signature that sometimes vanished beneath the heat shimmer. In command rooms at Lorient and Brest, Dönitz's staff revised patrol schedules and supply rotations with the weary competence of men balancing risk and reward. Men in the Med and Atlantic pens listened for news of successes, allowing themselves brief satisfaction before the next order demanded departure. Allied naval commanders watched with increasing coordination, redirecting convoys and beefing up air patrol ranges to blunt the southern menace. The immediate result was a spike in sinkings, but also a more rapid Allied response that began to erode the initial gains achieved by surprise. Communities in the Caribbean and Gulf felt the pressure of proximity to war, blackouts, air raid drills, and the steady presence of foreign sailors in local bars and markets. No one imagined the complexity that would follow: neutral flag diplomacy, oil supply shocks, and the slow accrual of tactical countermeasures across far-flung bases. For Dönitz, the decision to shift southward was both necessary and perilous, an admission that the East Coast campaign had met organized resistance it could not easily outflank. The wolf packs had adapted, and in doing so changed the map of the Atlantic War, turning it into a broader, more dispersed conflict. The hunters shifted their gaze to warmer waters. The flare lit the horizon before the alarm did. Luis Hernandez, a roustabout on a Louisiana quay, heard the blast while he tightened a wrench at an oil tank manifold. Out on the water, the tanker's stern folded under a G7E's impact, and a column of flame and black smoke shot skyward. Men in the wheelhouse shouted as gauges smashed, and the radio sputtered warnings that were soon lost in steam and fire. A Coast Guard cutter's engines screamed as they punched through chop at 22 knots toward burning wreckage, hulls flexing with each surge. Crewmen on deck scrubbed at flaming deck plating while others threw lines to survivors, whose clothes still smouldered. The blast was not a single spectacle but a pattern repeated along the Gulf, night after night, a pale orange wreath where commerce once floated. Photographers from regional papers snapped frames that would travel inland and harden fear into headlines. On U-boat conning towers, commanders watched the vertical glow and noted coordinates with the dispassionate precision of a logbook entry. The immediate effect was both practical and visceral. Shipping lanes warred with light and smoke, and communities learned the shape of loss by night. Fishermen off the Burrataria Bay line cut nets and stared as oily rain fell like ash on their decks. Old Man Carter, who had been hauling speckled trout for 30 years, rowed toward a drifting lifeboat with a pole and a lantern. From shore, families gathered on piers, radios pressed to chests, listening to the static-laced bulletins that named towns and listed survivors by number. Children with pajamas wrapped tight pressed against their mothers, eyes reflecting the distant flames as if they were watching a grim fireworks show. the smell of burning crude carried inland, settling in kitchens and on porches where coffee cooled forgotten. Port authorities logged the times of attacks in ledger books, the ink blotting as if the documentation itself felt heavy with consequence. Insurance brokers recalculated premiums at their desks, their pencils moving with the economic arithmetic of war. Cargo lost, refineries at risk, fuel flows uncertain. Local mayors convened emergency committees under fluorescent light, discussing blackout rules and improvised shelters for dockworkers and their families. Naval intelligence received fragmented reports and began to connect the orange flares into geographic patterns of vulnerability. What they didn't yet know was that the Gulf's fires signaled not only immediate destruction but a strategic pressure point that could choke Allied logistics if allowed to continue. Night watches on Coast Guard cutters tasted of coffee and diesel, as lookouts strained against the darkness for any hint of a periscope. The cutters rode low in the water, their bilge keels cutting foam while stern crews readied depth charges set to detonate at 70 meters. When the first flare lit the sky off a Mississippi delta, men lashed into life rafts and the radio operator keyed a distress tone with trembling fingers. Pilots in Catalinas heard the call and throttled their radial engines to economy RPM for the long transit from air bases in Florida and Cuba. The aircraft arrived breathing heavily, their wings still oil-slicked from previous sorties, and began a coordinated search pattern over the darkened patch of sea. Depth charge explosions rolled like distant thunder, sending white plumes that stained the night and shook the cutter's decks. Medics on shore stood ready by with blankets and morphine, their hands trained by the sequence of triage now carved into routine. Survivors recounted the geometry of impact: a flash aft, a crunch, the lurch of a keel giving way, details that would be passed by investigators and engineers. In naval war rooms, these first-hand accounts fed into revised patrol plans and the hurried mapping of convoy corridors away from known danger zones. No one imagined then how quickly air-sea coordination and improved gear would begin to close the net around the hunters. Inside the Port Arthur refinery control room, foremen tracked burn rates and crude inventories on chalkboards that now seemed to measure something existential. Managers like Eleanor Price, a refinery operations supervisor, sat amid the hum of pumps and the clack of relays as they recalculated how many days fuel remained if tankers stopped arriving. Workers at the docks did improvised repairs on barges while Union stewards negotiated escorted convoys for essential shipments. The strategic consequence was immediate fuel that would have gone to British convoys or North African operations was now at risk in domestic harbors. Washington's logistics planners started modeling worst-case scenarios in which the Gulf's reduced throughput would cascade into shortages on battlefronts far away. Shipowners rerouted cargoes, preferring longer coastal hauls or more guarded convoy channels, which slowed deliveries and raised costs. The political pressure rose. Congressional hearings summoned naval chiefs to answer why the oil spine of the nation was vulnerable. Advisors argued about whether to press for more air bases, greater escort production, or diplomatic measures to protect neutral ports used by tankers. Engineers on both sides studied damaged tankers to learn exactly where hulls failed under torpedo impact and how double-bottom designs might mitigate future losses. The effect was clear. The Gulf attacks had quickly escalated a logistical problem into a strategic vulnerability that demanded industrial and political remedies. In the U-boat pens, commanders logged their Gulf sorties with clinical detachment, recording tonnage and time like surgeons, noting vital signs. Captain Lieutenant Eric Topp wrote in his patrol book about night approaches, the careful setting of torpedo depth to the tanker's freeboard, and the angle on the bearing circle, Crews adapted tactics: wait for tankers to pass through choke points, strike aft to ignite fuel, and withdraw on silent electric motors to avoid wake detection. Technicians noted the corrosive effect of warm, sulfur-rich Gulf water on torpedo casings and radio connectors, filing maintenance requests with increasing frequency. Men joked in low voices about the exotic storms and the mosquitoes, but humor often died quickly in the face of black smoke on the horizon. At night, captains compared notes over maps smeared with grease and ink, plotting the next prowls toward river mouths and loading jetties. The tactical winds were intoxicating. A single tanker ablaze could be worth weeks of supply denial if not quickly replaced. Yet each success also broadcast a new problem. The larger the fires, the sooner air patrols and convoy escorts would be concentrated in response. What they didn't yet know in the pens was that the Allies' industrial muscle and intelligence networks could turn local gains into strategic overreach for the U-boats. Determination sat beside an increasing caution in their logs. Victories tasted of triumph and of an expense that would be paid in attrition. By late June, Allied codebreakers and coastal patrol coordination began to show results in action. Intercepted communications, when pieced together, suggested concentrations of U-boat activity around the Yucatan Channel and the mouth of the Mississippi. With that intelligence, long-range patrol aircraft were vectored to patrol arcs that extended the visual and radar bubble over previously dark water. Catalinas refueled with auxiliary tanks and flew at altitudes that optimized fuel economy while maintaining airspeed around 95 knots for search patterns. Escort groups formed quicker, with destroyers practicing coordinated sonar sweeps and exchange protocols for bearing fixes relayed from aircraft. Hedgehog projectors and depth charge patterns were refined using contact reports from hydrophones and sonar echoes that gave bearings with improved fidelity. Allied aircrews reported more frequent sightings of periscopes and slicks, and commanders adjusted convoy routes to cross predicted U-boat lanes at angles that minimized exposure. In Caribbean command rooms, planners felt the cumulative effect. Intelligence plus air reach plus escorts began to blunt the frequency of unmolested attacks. No one imagined yet that these measures multiplied in time and scale would eventually make the Gulf a far less forgiving hunting ground for U-boats. The effect, however, was already visible. Attacks continued, but with decreasing impunity, and U-boat commanders began to reckon with increasingly costly operations. The tactical interplay hardened into doctrine as hunter-killer teams became the preferred response to reported contacts. A destroyer escort would drive to a sonar contact while a Catalina circled above, marking position with a faint smoke float to guide nighttime illumination. Crews trained for rapid coordination, flare patterns, illumination rounds, and the timing of hedgehog salvos to saturate a possible submarine track. Night fighting squadrons practiced the risky business of low-altitude illumination using parachute flares that could briefly blind enemy lookouts as well as friendlies. Hydrophone networks were expanded, buoyed by volunteers and civil maritime services who deployed listening posts along vulnerable stretches. The Allies also used code-breaking to predict likely convoy routes, establishing ambushes rather than merely responding to attacks after the fact. Engineering workshops produced improved depth charge pistols calibrated to explode at shallower depths common in the Gulf's continental shelf. The cumulative effect was to decrease the margin of surprise the U-boats had once enjoyed and to force them into riskier, shallower attacks. What they didn't yet know on both sides was how this iterative pressure would, over months, reshape the very calculus of submarine warfare. For now, the night skies and the sonar pings testified that a new kind of joint warfare had been born. Survivors told their tales in hushed municipal halls where prayers were offered and lists of lost were read aloud under electric lights. Small memorials grew on beaches where volunteers left flowers and worn boots, tokens of lives called back to the sea in flame and salt. Environmental havoc followed the human tragedy. Birds coated in oil stunned marine life, and beaches blackened for days by a sheen that would not quickly wash away. Refineries rerouted shipments and built redundancy into systems that had once trusted smooth seas and steady tankers. In U-boat pens, commanders logged both success and the creeping costs of longer operations. Men fatigued, equipment corroded, and the moral arithmetic of wartime choices complicated by faces of survivors. Across Allied command rooms, intelligence officers compiled patterns into doctrine and pushed for shipbuilding programs to ensure escorts outnumbered attackers. The Gulf campaign, brief and brutal, taught both sides lessons about reach, cost, and the fragility of maritime logistics in war. And as the smoke thinned and ships limped into port for repair, the simple image of burning oil remained, a candlelight on the vast indifferent sea. That image would haunt policy rooms and family kitchens alike for years to come, a reminder of vulnerability as much as valor. The oil fires burned like candles upon the sea. The sonar operator's knuckles whitened as a faint, regular ping returned from the dark, a rhythm that meant something alive was nearby. On the bridge of the destroyer USS Ebola, Lieutenant James Callow adjusted the gain and watched the oscilloscope curl into a repeating signature, propeller blades cutting water at a slow, insidious tempo. Below, on U-552, Kapitän Lieutenant Eric Topp felt the hull shiver as the first depth charges detonated downrange. The explosion's pressure wave rattled rivets and sent oil-slick eddies across the surface. Men in the control room clung to braces while the hydrophone operator traced the echo and shouted distances in meters, the language of survival becoming arithmetic. Hedgehog mortars were readied on the destroyer's deck, contact solutions calculated by men who had learned to trust instruments over sight. The technical detail mattered. Depth charges set to detonate at 50, 100 meters. Hedgehog patterns spaced to compensate for current drift. In the narrow geometry of attack, a single misread bearing could mean the difference between evasion and hull rupture, and every calculation carried the weight of lives below. On U-552, the lights dimmed to red, and men whispered prayers like last resorts. The hunter heard a new sound now, not the roar of his own engines, but the precise, hungry pulse of anti-submarine warfare. What they didn't yet know was how rapidly these encounters would escalate into sustained attrition. Radar stations along the coast blinked awake with a new clarity as centimetric sets began to paint periscopes and low-profile conning towers on operators' screens. Long before human eyes could register them, the effect was immediate. Aircraft vectored to contacts hours earlier, and destroyers sent to pre-position in likely intercept arcs. In a patrol aircraft over the Atlantic, Ensign Robert Hale throttled back his right Cyclone engines to economize fuel while circling a small slick, spotted by radar at 8 miles out. He dropped a smoke float to mark the spot and radioed the bearing to the nearest escort group, his transmission a small, decisive thread in a widening net. On board U-123, Hardigan felt a pressure in the air as radio silence curbed any chance of a quick reposition. Sonar and radar together changed the geometry of engagement. The ocean's deceptive blankness no longer guaranteed anonymity. Technical innovations like high-frequency direction finding HF/DF also narrowed the field, enabling shore stations to triangulate bearing fixes from even brief German transmissions. The Corps' better detection produced the effect fewer free shots for U-boats and more forced evasions. No one imagined then how routinely these layered sensors would combine into lethal choreography. The night sky was a black dome pierced by the thin cone of a searchlight as escort formations tightened around a slow convoy, their wakes crisscrossing in a protective lattice. Depth charge patterns bloomed in the water like weird, deadly flowers. Each explosion sent up a column of spray that glittered for an instant under moonlight, and then fell back into black. Inside the U-boat's hull, a valve hissed where a minor leak pressed at a seam, a small sound that carried terror because small things often presaged catastrophe. Petty officers counted battery voltage and oxygen levels, knowing they could trade one peril for another, remain shallow and risk detection, dive deep and risk crushing pressure. Allied air patrols coordinated with surface units now, using radio beacons and homing signals to keep constant pressure on suspected contacts. The cumulative effect was attrition, a worn crew, frayed batteries, and torpedoes that had to be conserved for truly valuable targets. Commanders like Dönitz began to receive reports that were less triumphant and more granular. Lost boats, wounded crews, engagements where U-boats barely escaped with structural damage. What they didn't yet understand fully was how sustainable this combined pressure would be once production and training scaled against them. The hunter, once sovereign, felt the map of the sea shrink under new lines of Allied control. In a Lorient dry dock under blackout conditions, mechanics bent over blistered hull plates and replaced corroded fittings, while lamps cast them in a sepia fatigue. Technicians argued over which seals could be trusted and which needed replacement. Tropical corrosion and repeated depth-charge shock had a cumulative physical toll on steel and men alike. Captain Lieutenant Hardigan's log recorded a repaired leak at frame 56, and a battery bank replaced after a charge surge during evasive maneuvers, entries that read like a slow murder of operational endurance. The Kriegsmarine's maintenance schedules stretched dangerously thin as spare parts were reallocated to the most active flotillas, and dockyard capacity creaked under demand. Allied intelligence noted a tempo change and exploited patterns of repair and refit to predict which flotillas would be vulnerable on redeployment. The cause: sustained Allied pressure forced effect across the supply chain, with mechanical degradation becoming strategic weakness. Dönitz gritted his teeth over resource allocation meetings, balancing risk of immediate sortie against the certainty that a damaged boat might never return at all. No one imagined the moral toll this would have on crews who returned again and again to hulls marked by battle. The sea's machinery now included repair yards and supply lists, not just torpedoes and diesel. A depth charge exploded close enough to rattle every lamp and loose a bolt from its bracket, and in the cramped red-lit mess men crossed themselves or mouthed names they'd given to luck. Petty Officer Muller counted hearts quietly. 1, 3, a litany of breaths that kept the boat's humanity from dissolving into numbers. Men whispered promises to wives and children, promises they had no guarantee to keep. The confessions became a strange rite of solidarity in the small metal world. On the bridge, Hardigan's eyes were raw with sleepless hours, the strain etched into the line between his brows as he made tactical choices that weighed lives against orders. The psychological effect of constant threat showed in tremors, in voices that were too loud for laughter and too small for panic. Allied reports of U-boat crews showing signs of wear, slurred radio transmissions, missed bearings, suggested that attrition had reached the realm of morale as much as material. What they didn't yet know was how vital crew rotation and rest would become once supply chains could support it. for now exhaustion was an invisible enemy. The hunter began to hear the echo of his own fear not as rare interruption but as steady accompaniment. Each night ended with a reckoning in small diaries filled with terse, awful honesty. U-boat captains tried new ruses, night surface attacks, pack dispersals, and more daring infiltration of coastal shallows, but each variation invited a counter. Allied escorts refined hedgehog patterns and developed coordinated search algorithms that minimized false positives and maximized kill windows. On board U-66, Kapitän Lieutenant Werner Hartwig cursed a misfired gyrator that left a torpedo useless and told his crew to hold their nerve while the destroyer's sonar painted them in brutal clarity. Hedgehog salvos, which detonated on contact rather than at preset depth, changed the calculus of evasion and made deep dives less reliably safe. The technical interplay was relentless, a tweak in magnetic exploders here, a calibration in hydrophone arrays there, each alteration eroding the old advantages of stealth. Tactical experiments that once yielded successes now produced diminishing returns as Allied adaptation accelerated. What they didn't yet know was that manufacturing scale and training pipelines on the Allied side would soon outpace tactical ingenuity. Quantity and coordination would blunt German quality and cunning. The hunters' options narrowed as escorts learned not only to detect, but to think in patterns that anticipated submarine moves. Memos from Flotilla Command arrived with pallid formality listing boats lost or disabled, each entry a compressed tragedy of men and metal. Dönitz read the ledgers with a face that betrayed the mathematics of despair, increasing losses multiplied by the logistical burden of replacement and training. In England and America, lists of confirmed kills were celebrated in naval offices while flags were lowered in small coastal towns for the families of the missing. The strategic effect was cumulative. Every boat lost reduced the Kriegsmarine's ability to threaten convoys, and every sunk U-boat became a study in vulnerabilities for Allied engineers. Survivors' testimonies, the sudden crush, the sound of air escaping, the bitter taste of salt fed into technical improvements on both sides, refining depth charge patterns and hull strengthening. What they didn't yet know was how long it would take for production of escorts and long-range aircraft to reach a tipping point that made U-boat operations steadily less sustainable. For now, the immediate moral on both sides was raw. Triumph tasted of cost, and cost accumulated into a strategic decline that was only beginning. The hunters' tally quietly turned red with loss. As summer deepened, the ocean's acoustics carried different stories. Not only the sporadic crack of a successful strike, but the steady, grinding music of sustained counterforce. U-boat captains adjusted their logs to include the new metric, days since last safe passage, and sailors marked rotations with a rueful gratitude when shore leave finally arrived. Allied intelligence celebrated improved interception rates and recalibrated patrol maps to close previously exploitable gaps, turning once safe corridors into danger lanes. In the pens, commanders spoke less of glory and more of sustainability, a language of supply and crew welfare that substituted for boastful dispatches. Men began to understand that being hunted demanded a different measure of courage, one that included patience, repair, and retreat when necessary. What they didn't yet fully comprehend was how decisive this phase would be, the turning of technology, industry, and morale against a threat that had once seemed unstoppable. The hunter listened now, not for the silence of success, but for the echo of his own fear, and that echo altered every decision on every bridge and in every cramped control room. For the first time, the hunters could hear the echo of their own fear. The aircraft's engines hummed like a metronome against the low Atlantic haze as Lieutenant Robert Hale adjusted his altitude to 600 feet. Below him stretched an ocean too calm, too empty, its glassy surface giving back only the faint reflection of his shadow. For hours, he and his crew had scanned the waves for the telltale swirl of a periscope or the slick that marked a submarine's passage. But there was nothing. The U-boats that once prowled these waters had gone silent, their confidence eroded by the unblinking vigilance above. The radar scope flickered, static, not contact, and the radio operator scratched a note into the log. Patrol complete, no sightings. Hale leaned back, feeling the mix of relief and melancholy that came with hunting ghosts. The sky was too bright, the sea too still, and in the absence of prey the silence itself felt like a eulogy. What he didn't yet know was that this quiet marked not peace, but the exhaustion of an era, the end of the hunter's long advantage. In Lorient, Admiral Karl Dönitz stood motionless before the operations map, the soft glow of desk lamps spilling over red and blue markers that no longer moved as swiftly as before. Reports had come in, not of tonnage sunk, but of boats missing, of names that would never again reply to signals. The silence in his office was heavier than the hum of nearby generators. Outside, the Atlantic winds rattled shutters, a sound that felt like the sea whispering of betrayal. Dönitz lifted his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and stared at casualty figures that made logic bow to inevitability. The Allied convoys, once scattered and slow, now moved like armored columns beneath a sky filled with sentinels, aircraft, radar, and escort vessels, in flawless choreography. He had asked his captains for courage, and they had given it. Now he asked the ocean for favor, and it gave him nothing. Aides entered quietly with memos detailing the arrival of new Allied escort carriers in the mid-Atlantic gap. The final refuge of stealth was gone. He nodded once, silently. The map had turned from instrument to indictment. Off the coast of Newfoundland, a crippled U-boat broke the surface under Allied escort, her hull scorched and listing. British sailors stood at the rails of HMS Bulldog, binoculars raised as the German crew emerged with raised hands, oil-streaked and hollow-eyed. A boarding team crossed the gap in rubber dinghies, weapons slung low, the air tense but strangely respectful. The captured submarine, once the terror of convoys, was now a relic, a specimen for engineers, a trophy for intelligence analysts. On shore, the hull was hauled to port under grey skies, cameras recording the scene for morale bulletins that would run in London and Washington alike. The smell of diesel, salt and rust mingled with Victory's muted satisfaction. Technicians in coveralls examined her sonar dome, her torpedo tubes, the broken dials in her control room, artifacts of a fading strategy. What they didn't yet know was that this single captured boat would yield insights into code books and tactics that would accelerate the war's turn. The hunter had been dissected by its prey, and the ocean that once concealed had now revealed. In Allied command centers from Reykjavik to Norfolk, radar plots now showed something extraordinary. Wide swaths of uncontacted patrol zones, convoys steamed under near-continuous air cover, and the black pit of the Atlantic, once unreachable by land-based aircraft, was now bridged by long-range liberators. Pilots who once flew blind across featureless water now relied on radar returns that could spot a snorkel or a conning tower before the human eye ever could. The balance of senses had shifted. Man no longer hunted by instinct alone but by signal and computation. Allied escort carriers, small but numerous, deployed Wildcats and Avengers to patrol around convoys, making even the open ocean feel claustrophobic to the submariner. Each technical gain, centimetric radar, HF/DF triangulation, ley lights, was a nail in the coffin of U-boat supremacy. No one imagined 2 years earlier that the skies themselves would become an ocean of steel, endless and merciless. For U-boat crews, the war had shrunk from vast horizons to a series of desperate dives and exhausted ascents. The Atlantic, once a friend, had turned omniscient. In the tight, red-lit control room of U-402, Kapitän-Leutnant Heinrich Vogt watched the depth gauge tremble between 70 and 80 meters. The sonar pings above were closer now, a cadence of inevitability. Each ping struck the hull like a heartbeat outside his chest. Around him, men worked with mechanical precision, adjusting ballast, whispering oxygen levels, clutching talismans in their pockets. The first depth charge detonated close enough to strip paint from bulkheads. The second cracked a pressure gauge. Water hissed through a seam. Not fatal, not yet, but a warning written in physics. Vogt closed his eyes, hearing the rhythmic hiss of the bilge pump and the slow creak of steel bending under stress. Silent running, he whispered, though silence had already taken everything else. What he didn't yet know was that above him, aircraft circling in relay meant no rest, no surface, no escape. For the first time, a U-boat commander understood what it was to be trapped in the vastness he once commanded. In Washington and London, maps told a new story. Convoy losses had fallen by half in a single quarter, while U-boat sinkings doubled. Admiral King briefed Roosevelt with a grim pride, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and vindication. Charts of tonnage protected replaced charts of tonnage lost. A quiet revolution of perspective. In Halifax, escort captains shared whiskey and relief, their conversations filled with names of ships saved rather than sunk. The pattern was unmistakable. Coordination, not courage alone, had reclaimed the Atlantic. Airfields stretched farther westward. Escort carriers filled gaps once called graveyards, and technology turned endurance into dominance. On the other side of the war, Dönitz's staff stopped celebrating tonnage sunk and began calculating survival rates. What they didn't yet know was that the shift they had sensed was irreversible. Industry, intelligence, and air power had combined into a tide that no single tactic could reverse. The hunters were being erased not by chance but by progress itself. Those few U-boats that limped home carried more ghosts than men. Crews staggered ashore at Lorient and Saint Nazaire, their uniforms salt-crusted, their eyes unfocused. Some refused shore leave, preferring the mechanical certainty of work to the vulnerability of rest. The dock workers greeted them without fanfare. The rituals of triumph had grown too heavy to bear. In officers' clubs, silence replaced song, and toasts were raised to absent names. Engineers counted damaged pressure hulls, and physicians counted sleepless nights. Dönitz met returning captains with quiet handshakes, and fewer words each time. His command had become a study in endurance, not ambition. What they didn't yet know was that history would later call this moment the breaking point. The legend of the invincible wolf pack had begun to dissolve into smoke and statistics. By year's end, the Atlantic had grown quieter again, but this silence was different. Not the quiet of dominance, but of exhaustion. The convoys moved under watchful skies, and beneath them lay the wrecks of hundreds of submarines, scattered like bones across the seabed. Each wreck marked a story unfinished, a final dive, a last signal, a breath held too long. Pilots flying above often reported strange upwellings of oil, small black stains that folded back into the waves, as if the ocean were reclaiming its secrets. For Dönitz, the war became arithmetic. Boats commissioned versus boats lost, and the balance grew crueler by the month. Allied commanders, for their part, studied lessons rather than celebrating victories. They knew the sea would demand vigilance again. What no one imagined was how these lessons would shape the next wars, wars of detection, distance, and invisible machines. The Atlantic, once the hunter's domain, had become a graveyard of ambitions. The ocean, once an ally, had turned against its own. The diver's fins stirred a slow cloud of silt as he drifted downward, his breathing a rhythmic hiss in the deep stillness. Light from the surface filtered through layers of green, dimming with each meter, until the world became a cathedral of quiet. Ahead, the faint outline of steel emerged from the gloom. A submarine, broken and half buried in sand. The hull was split open near the bow. Torn metal curled like petals around an invisible wound. A rusted torpedo tube gaped toward the dark, now home to fish and coral. The diver extended a gloved hand, brushing away silt from a number etched faintly into the steel. U-352. His fingertips left trails of clean grey on the oxidized surface, the texture of history under pressure. Around him, the wreck seemed alive with its own ecosystem, the hum of the ocean replacing the pulse of engines long gone. For a moment he hovered in reverence, suspended between two eras, one of war, one of memory. The hunter had become a monument. Inside the wreck, light from the diver's lamp slid across walls crusted with barnacles, revealing the ghostly geometry of a control room. The levers were frozen mid-command, gauges still marked with impossible readings. Depth, trim, fuel, tangled wires hung like vines from the ceiling. A cracked cup rested near a corroded valve, its porcelain painted with the faded insignia of the Kriegsmarine eagle. The diver's exhale sent a small ring of bubbles toward the surface, rising slowly, impossibly far away. His companion floated beside him, camera steady, recording the silent choreography of decay and discovery. In a corner, a logbook lay open beneath a thin layer of sediment, pages fused but faintly legible, names, numbers, bearings, a life reduced to ink in the dark. What they didn't yet know, years earlier when they wrote it, was that the final entry would never be closed. The ocean had become the archivist of everything left unsaid. On land, decades after the war, men with silver hair and trembling hands gathered in a museum along the German coast. Photographs lined the walls, U-boat crews, convoys and coastlines now reclaimed by time. Captain Reinhard Hardigan, once a hunter of these waters, spoke quietly to a younger interviewer about the day the tide turned. His words came haltingly, each sentence carrying the weight of memory disguised as discipline. "We believed we could control the sea," he said. "But the sea, it cannot be controlled." Around him, families of lost sailors listened, some in silence, others weeping softly into folded programs. The veteran's eyes often wandered to the models and relics, a periscope, a rusted compass, the familiar shape of a submarine now small enough to fit behind glass. What they didn't yet know, when they were young, was that survival itself would become a burden, a lifetime of echoes that never quite stopped. Memory, it turned out, was another kind of deep. Across the Atlantic, fishermen off North Carolina still hauled nets that snagged on something unyielding, the steel bones of war. They called them the wrecks, never specifying which side they belonged to. In Beaufort, old-timers told stories of nights when the ocean burned red and oil washed ashore like ink. A local diver named Marcus Dyer spent 20 years mapping those wrecks, photographing the U-boats lying quiet beneath the same waters they once terrorized. His photos captured the paradox, death rendered beautiful by time and salt. Each dive was both archaeology and elegy, a conversation with ghosts who never answered. The currents had softened every edge, the violence worn into grace. What no one imagined then in 1942 was that these wrecks would become memorials, visited not in fear but in reverence. History had sunk, but it had not vanished. In an archive in Hamburg, curators unsealed a box labeled Drumbeat Correspondence. Inside lay unopened letters, mail recovered from sunken ships, warped but preserved. A woman's handwriting looped across a page. "We miss you, Carl. The garden has bloomed this spring." She never knew the letter was delivered to the seabed, not her husband's hands. Nearby were Allied reports of sinkings, official and clinical, the language of numbers attempting to quantify heartbreak. Historians catalogued them carefully, scanning each page into digital eternity. A century's worth of empathy flickered on screens that glowed coldly against the ink of grief. The cause, human conflict, produced an effect that outlived victory itself: remembrance. What they didn't yet know, when those letters were written, was that they would one day be read underwater, illuminated by the beams of divers, searching for names. Even in paper and salt, humanity persisted. Nature had done what treaties could not: reclaim the wrecks and make them harmless. Corals wrapped the torpedo tubes in bright colonies of red and blue. Fish darted through open hatches where sailors once ran drills. Each structure had become a reef, sustaining life where it had once destroyed it. Marine biologists charted these artificial ecosystems, noting how oxygen levels and biodiversity thrived around the rusting steel. To them, the wrecks were data points; to historians, they were altars. Divers sometimes removed small artifacts, a valve wheel, a shell casing, and donated them to museums. Though most agreed the sea was the better curator, the transformation was quiet, patient, inevitable, entropy as redemption. What they didn't yet know, when these hulls went down in flames, was that they would one day cradle life in their decay. The war had left scars, but the ocean had turned them into veins of color. In Germany and America alike, memorials rose, not to victory, but to understanding. Stone walls carved with names of sailors who never returned. Plaques that faced the sea as if waiting for them still. At ceremonies, grey-haired veterans stood beside the children of those they once fought, silence bridging what language could not. A lone bugle sounded. The wind carried its note across the harbour until it vanished into waves. The descendants of the lost tossed wreaths into the water, white flowers that drifted outward, settling over the places where their ancestors slept. The cameras rolled, but the emotion was older than film could capture. In museums, children stared at models of submarines and asked simple questions. Why did they fight? Why did they die there? No historian could answer in full. The answers belonged to the tide. The war had become history, but the cost had not diminished. The ocean's calm was not forgetfulness. It was forgiveness. Back beneath the waves, the diver surfaced slowly, air bubbles rising around him like souls escaping steel. Above, the water glimmered, sunlight bending through 1,000 feet of history. The wreck receded into shadow, its shape dissolving into the folds of the sea that had both taken and preserved it. On the surface, gulls circled and the diver pulled off his mask, the air tasting both familiar and sacred. Somewhere below him, the logbook still rested. The cup still lay unbroken. The silence still waited. The ocean had recorded everything. The hubris, the terror, the courage, the surrender, in languages only the deep could speak. For the world above, Operation Drumbeat was a campaign for the world below. It was memory incarnate. Even after rust and coral had erased the details, the essence remained. human ambition meeting natural eternity. The sea forgets nothing, it merely grows quieter. Even in silence the sea remembers. The first lesson was written, not in ink, but in loss, in a narrow London office, smelling of damp paper and machine oil. Lieutenant Commander Arthur Miles leaned over a desk piled with reports stamped confidential. Atlantic operations. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the sound of typewriters clacking through the night as clerks compiled new training manuals for convoy escort crews. Each page represented a principle born from tragedy: spacing intervals, escort rotations, radio silence codes, radar coordination. Miles circled a paragraph describing Mutual Defense Formation Alpha, his pencil pausing as he recalled the winter when tankers burned off New Jersey. Around him, the dim yellow light made ghosts of the men still awake. The printers below thudded rhythmically, as if the presses themselves were keeping vigil for the dead. Outside in the blackout streets, messengers carried rolled documents to naval colleges and coastal commands. The doctrine that would save future fleets was being forged in quiet rooms far from the sea. What they didn't yet know was that these words would outlast the men who wrote them. In the weeks following Drumbeat's end, the Royal Navy and U.S. Navy began a joint effort to codify every lesson learned. Meetings stretched into the early hours, charts projected on canvas, pins marking where coordination had failed and where it had worked. His uniform immaculate despite fatigue, pointed at the new convoy grid system, arguing for tighter inter-service communication and shared radar frequencies. American officers, wary of British formality, pushed for faster relay structures and more autonomy for coastal commands. The tension of egos and empires melted in the face of necessity. By dawn, consensus emerged. Convoy defense was no longer optional. It was the law of survival. In Halifax, destroyer captains trained new crews on anti-submarine sweeps with sonar pings, timed in perfect cadence. Radar operators learned to read flickers of interference as language, the pulse of unseen movement. No one imagined then that this humble matrix of cooperation would redefine ocean warfare for generations. The Atlantic, once chaos, was becoming choreography. In a darkened coastal command bunker, Flight Officer Margaret Keane watched a radar screen flicker with pale circles of light, each sweep revealing the ghostly movement of ships and weather fronts. The hum of electronics and the murmur of operators filled the room, the heartbeat of a new kind of warfare. Radar had transformed the sea into something visible, something measurable. She adjusted the gain, refining the bloom until a convoy appeared as a constellation of green echoes. Somewhere within that pattern, a ship's captain would sleep a little easier. The room was a world apart from the days when reports came only from binoculars and Morse lamps. Outside, rain lashed against the windows of the command center, but inside the operators sat calm, lit by the glow of understanding. What they didn't yet know was that these radar screens were the ancestors of an entirely new kind of warfare, one ruled by information, not distance. Knowledge had become the new armor. At dawn in Halifax, fog rolled across the harbour as ships eased from their berths, forming lines like dancers in a slow ritual. Destroyers led the way, sonar pings echoing faintly through the water, as merchantmen followed in deliberate spacing. On the docks, officers checked manifests and route codes, their breath visible in the chill. Families stood quietly on the pier, waving to silhouettes rather than faces. The convoy system that had once been improvised under fire was now a symphony of procedure: departure schedules, air cover rotations, radio call signs. The discipline of it carried a strange beauty, order reclaiming what chaos had taken. From Newfoundland to Gibraltar, the ocean now pulsed with organization, each formation a testament to adaptation. What no one imagined a year earlier was that fear could evolve into professionalism so quickly. The same waters that had burned now glittered with the promise of safety in numbers. The war had learned to move with grace. In a laboratory in Liverpool, engineers leaned over tanks of water, dropping miniature charges and measuring the reflected echo with sensitive microphones. Sonar had grown from crude beginnings into an art form, a way to paint with sound. The lead technician, Dr. Henry Atwell, recorded patterns on graph paper, each curve an insight into the ocean's acoustic secrets. He explained to a young ensign how temperature layers bent sound, how thermoclines could hide submarines or reveal them depending on the angle. What had once been guesswork now became geometry. Out at sea, sonar operators trained to trust their instruments more than their nerves, reading depth as if reading thought. The ocean, once the U-boat's ally, had been mapped in echoes. Every ping told a story of distance, of depth, of detection. No one imagined that in mastering this soundscape, humanity had entered a new dialogue with the sea itself. What once hid now whispered. Naval academies filled with the next generation, cadets reading ASW manual, Volume 2 beneath portraits of men who had died, proving its worth. Chalk dust floated in classrooms as instructors drew the ideal convoy geometry on blackboards, the arcs of sonar coverage, and the mathematics of endurance. Outside, the sound of young men marching in formation carried across parade grounds, their boots striking in time with the rhythm of history. Instructors spoke with reverence for those who had not returned, turning their sacrifices into lessons. Drumbeat taught us more than pain, one admiral said. It taught us order. Across Allied fleets, procedure replaced improvisation, training replaced panic. The cause was tragedy. The effect, transformation. What they didn't yet know was that these principles would echo beyond war, into shipping lanes, rescue operations, and the peaceful governance of seas. From chaos had come discipline, and discipline had saved the world's arteries. Years later, historians and analysts would revisit Drumbeat's data, spreading out charts and decrypted messages across archival tables. The picture was clear in hindsight, a campaign of brilliance undone by overreach and answered by evolution. The scholars spoke quietly, reverently, as if in church. They traced the progression from uncoordinated panic to unified doctrine, from scattered reaction to collective design. In Allied war colleges, the case study of Operation Drumbeat became required reading, a reminder that vulnerability is the mother of innovation. Some found irony in the symmetry. Germany had perfected the U-boat, but the Allies had perfected the system to defeat it. What they didn't yet know, perhaps even then, was how this cycle would repeat through history. Every weapon birthing its countermeasure, every darkness teaching light. In the end, the ocean had not chosen sides. It had simply reflected human learning in motion. At sunset, a convoy steamed eastward under a sky of gold and grey, its lead destroyer cutting a steady line across calm water. From above, the formation resembled a page of perfect handwriting, aligned, deliberate, alive with discipline. The pilots, circling high in their patrol planes, watched silently, proud and alert. In London, a clerk filed the final after-action report on Operation Drumbeat, his pen scratching the closing words, lessons incorporated, threat contained. The sea, for now, was secure. Yet as the camera pulls back, the narrator's voice softens, reminding that every calm is temporary, every vigilance earned in blood. What they didn't yet know was that the lessons of this campaign would echo into every future conflict fought upon the waves. Out of fire came foresight, out of loss learning, from terror came vigilance, from silence understanding. The convoy's bow cut through grey water, as if correcting history itself. From the bridge of the escort carrier Searcher, Captain William Price watched a line of hulls stretch to the horizon. Radar screens glowed beneath his feet like small moons, each blip a promise of vigilance. Below, destroyers churned at 22 knots, their sonar operators tracing echoes with precise fingers. Aircrews on deck ran final checks on Wildcat engines, their radial pistons ticking in the chill. In the radio room, coded messages flowed between columns, coordinating timing to the minute. This was no individual duel, but a coordinated movement of industrial scale, where production met doctrine. Convoys carried not only cargo but the weight of entire theaters, fuel, food, tanks, and men. The visual spectacle was both practical and majestic, a rolling fortress under sail. It signaled a new phase. The Allies were no longer merely surviving the Atlantic, they were mastering it. At sea, and in archives alike, historians point to 1943 as the hinge year where systems converged. Improved radar, centimetric sets, and centimeter wave receivers shrank the sea's anonymity. Long-range liberators now bridged the air gap that once allowed U-boats to operate with impunity. Carrier groups with Avengers and Wildcats projected air power where land could not. The effect was cumulative. Detection improved, reaction times fell, and safe corridors expanded. Technicians recalibrated sonar arrays to account for thermal layers, turning sound into actionable maps. Shipyards churned out escorts, corvettes, frigates, and destroyer escorts. At numbers that overwhelmed attrition, men trained in anti-sub warfare learned standardized procedures that made joint action fluid. Yet for every technological gain there was an adaptation required, a tweak in tactics and doctrine. What they didn't yet know in the moment was how irreversible this industrial momentum would become. From the U-boat pens, the mood hardened into statistical calculation as losses climbed. Commanders like Dönitz began to see percentages where once they had seen opportunity. Boats were still dispatched, brave and efficient, but the margin of error had thinned to a razor. A single detection now invited entire hunter-killer groups and airborne reinforcements within hours. On the bridge of an Allied destroyer, Lieutenant Commander Scott, sonar readings steady, tracked a contact that would lead to 3 hedgehog salvos. The resultant oil slick and debris marked another loss on Admiralty charts, a grim punctuation. Each sinking was logged, studied, and fed back into training cycles, shortening the time between mistake and correction. Technical duel became a cascade of improvement on one side and attrition on the other. No one imagined the scale of the shipbuilding programs that would soon tip numerical advantage decisively. The Atlantic's balance of power was shifting from stealth to sustained supply. In the air, patrols learned to fly longer, lower, and with instruments honed to the hunt. Pilots like Flight Lieutenant Evans would fly 13-hour sorties over featureless water, fuel gauges a constant calculus. Catalinas and Liberators carried depth charges and lee lights primed to cut the dark with sudden glare. When a periscope or snorkel lit on radar at dawn, coordinated response would descend within minutes. Escort carriers positioned themselves between convoy columns, launching aircraft that extended the convoy's protective umbrella. The tactical interplay was intricate. Radar painted, hydrophones listened, aircraft boxed the space above, and escorts pressed below. Caught in that net, a submarine's options were few: dive deeper and risk hull failure, surface and face aircraft, or flee and hope for darkness. The cumulative pressure changed the nature of submarine warfare from opportunistic raids to desperate gambits. What they didn't yet know was how much Allied air superiority, paired with industry, would erode the U-boat threat long-term. The sky had become as much a battleground as the sea below. On shore, admirals and planners translated tactical success into strategic doctrine that would outlast the campaign. In Washington and London, factory orders were doubled and training schools expanded to meet the demand. Convoys grew larger but also more flexible, sometimes breaking into sub-convoys to confuse tracking. Intelligence fusion centers combined HF/DF fixes with decrypted Enigma material, producing a map of probable U-boat locations. The effect was operational predictability that favored the convoy rather than the hunter. Naval architects improved escort designs for seakeeping, endurance, and sonar performance in rough Atlantic conditions. Crews rotated more predictably, reducing wear and maintaining readiness across long campaigns. Sustained logistics allowed the Allies to replace losses faster than enemies could inflict them, a turning of arithmetic into strategy. Historians now see this phase as the maturation of maritime industrial warfare, an ecosystem of production, tactics, and intelligence. No one imagined earlier that logistics could be weaponized into strategic dominance. Yet within the numbers lay countless human stories: stokers burned by boilers, airmen who never saw the sea again, sailors who learned to read pings like scripture, deck logs, letters home, and hospital records trace the imprint of this mechanized struggle upon individual lives. A corvette's carpenter wrote of nights when depth charges rocked his knees and prayers rose with each explosion. A pilot's widow saved matchbooks from the bar where he last drank rum before a patrol, small talismans of a life measured in sorties. Naval surgeons developed techniques for decompressing rescued submariners whose lungs had kissed pressure wrong. Port towns swelled with repair crews whose hands bore the stains of salt and service, their labor invisible to strategic charts. The macro of production and doctrine therefore had a micro cost, a ledger of bodies and quiet grief. What they didn't yet know was how these stories would feed into collective memory, shaping post-war publics and policies. Museums, memorials, and oral histories would later stitch these fragments into a national narrative of sacrifice. The Ocean's War was a symphony only because men and machines had learned to play together at terrible tempo. In the final years of the conflict, the Atlantic theater saw fewer dramatic nighttime flares and more methodical daylight engagements. Allied escorts hunted with confidence born of training and numbers, combining airdrops with sonar sweeps and hedgehog barrages. U-boat captains adapted with snorkels, night surface dash tactics, and nocturnal evasion. But the window for success narrowed. Fleet pages filled with entries, sorties flown, ships protected, U-boats destroyed, tonnages delivered. Each statistic represented an axis of human labor: shipwrights, cipher clerks, radar technicians. Working in invisible choreography, commanders wrote after-action reports that would become case studies in naval colleges for decades. The theater's final arc was not a single battle, but the steady accretion of advantage through constant innovation. No one imagined how decisively the wartime marriage of industry and intelligence would determine outcomes at sea. The Allied mastery of logistics and detection made the ocean a contested but increasingly controlled space. The wider war at sea had become, in its final analysis, an array of human systems acting in concert. As the guns quieted and peace returned, charts of convoy routes became schoolroom maps, and sonar pings a memory stored on paper reels. Wreck markers dotted charts like cautious punctuation, each with a name and a story beneath the waves. Historians in quiet rooms traced the lineage of tactics from Drumbeat to D-Day, seeing continuity in adaptation and learning. Veterans' reunions filled halls where former enemies exchanged terse nods, and then longer conversations about shared losses. Children who grew up in port towns told new stories that began with oil fires and ended with rebuilding docks and schools. Technological advances seeded post-war civil applications, radar into air traffic control, sonar into fisheries, science, logistics into global trade. The strategic awe of those years lingered as a reminder. Wars are vast machines with human gears, and mastery requires both ingenuity and endurance. What they didn't yet realize during the war was that the symphony of machines and men would become a template for modern naval doctrine worldwide. The lessons of the Atlantic shaped navies, scholars, and industries for generations beyond the immediate conflict. The ocean's war had become a symphony of machines and men. The paper floated among the oil, its ink bleeding into the rainbow sheen that spread across the Atlantic like grief itself. The waves nudged it gently, as if reluctant to destroy what it carried. A line of script still visible through the water read, "Tell Anna a dream of spring." The envelope bore no address now, only salt soot and the faint impression of a naval postmark dated February 1942. Nearby, debris from a merchant ship bobbed in the current. A life buoy, a half-burnt shoe, a tin of biscuits split open. A gull circled once and vanished into the mist. The letter turned slowly, catching the light, a last fragile link between worlds divided by war. What the sender didn't know was that his words would outlive the ship that carried them. When divers found it decades later, sealed inside a glass bottle by chance, they would call it the Atlantic's whisper. In a small house in Bristol, Margaret Lewis stood before her door as a uniformed boy approached on his bicycle. He dismounted, hat clutched awkwardly, the telegram in his hand already heavy with meaning. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, the words brief and brutal. "Regret to inform you, vessel lost, presumed all hands." The clock ticked in the next room, out of rhythm with her breath. Behind her, a kettle boiled over, steam hissing like the sea itself. She sat down without speaking, the paper fluttering to the floor beside her slippers. Through the window, rain began to fall. Soft, persistent, ordinary. Across the ocean in Hamburg, another mother opened a similar telegram and folded it carefully back into its envelope without reading it again. What neither woman could know was that the war had made grief a shared language. Two enemies, united by silence. On a wreck resting 70 meters down off Cape Hatteras, divers in the 1980s found a waterproof tin box wedged between rusted pipes. Inside were 3 pages of a sailor's journal, the handwriting still sharp despite the years. The first entry spoke of calm seas and laughter, the second of a strange echo on sonar, and the last, abruptly, of a light too close. Nothing followed. The divers read in their helmets, the words glowing in lamplight as if written moments ago. One of them, a former submariner himself, whispered, "He was my age." Above them, the surface shimmered, oblivious. What they didn't yet know was that these fragments would become museum artifacts, labeled but never explained. The emotion, like the ocean, resisted translation. The diary remained open when they left, its pages moving gently in the current as though still waiting for the next sentence. In 1943, railway stations across Britain and America filled with women waiting for news that rarely came. They carried letters of their own, folded, sealed, addressed, ready to send once the next ship reached port. Some of those ships never did. Postmasters worked through nights sorting sacks of returned mail. The ink blurred from damp holes and salt air. Each envelope represented a heartbeat that had been missed. In one letter, a wife described the new wallpaper in their home. In another, a father wrote to a son about a dog that wouldn't eat. Thousands of such details vanished between convoy lanes and coded reports. War's official language had no word for absence, only missing. What they didn't yet know was how these unposted letters would outlast the telegrams that replaced them. In the archives of history, it is the words unsent that speak loudest. Captain Eric Fode of U-402 had written a letter before his final patrol. Folded once, no envelope, tucked into his sea journal. He told his wife not to worry, promised the sea was kind to those who respected it, and ended with a line about their daughter's birthday. The letter never reached her. It was found in 1945 by Allied officers among recovered personal effects after the war, translated and retyped for documentation. It was quietly filed away, stripped of handwriting but not of humanity. Decades later, historians reprinted it in a naval exhibit beside the model of his submarine. Visitors read it slowly, often twice. On the wall behind it hung a photograph of the U-boat's final crew, young faces caught between discipline and hope. What no one imagined then was that the letter would survive longer than the ideology that sent him to sea. The ink of war fades, the ink of love endures. In 1944, a young American radioman named Samuel Pierce began keeping carbon copies of every letter he sent to his fiancée, Ruth. He numbered them. Letter 21, letter 22, each closing with, "See you after the sea." When his ship went down in the North Atlantic, the originals disappeared with it. But Ruth kept his duplicates tied with blue ribbon in a drawer. Years later, she donated them to a maritime museum, her handwriting small and steady. He said these were meant to last. A German archivist, working on the same exhibit, placed beside them a translated note from a U-boat engineer who had written to his brother, "I hope we meet again in a quieter world." The curators left both letters side by side. What they didn't yet know was that visitors would linger longest here, reading the space between them. Two lives never meeting, yet speaking the same sentence. At reunions decades later, veterans often fell quiet when asked about letters. Some laughed nervously, others stared into their coffee cups. Many admitted they stopped writing altogether during the worst months of the campaign, not from neglect but from superstition. "If I wrote," one said, "I'd imagine I'd never post it." Their restraint became its own form of hope, a silence that meant survival. Families who did receive letters treated them as relics, folded and unfolded until the creases frayed. Museums now display them in glass cases, the paper yellowed but still pulsing with intimacy. What they didn't yet know, back then, was that words could sink and still reach their destination. Memory, it seems, finds its own postal route. The ocean delivered in its own time. At dusk, waves wash over the wreck sites where these stories sleep, carrying fragments of ink and iron alike. Somewhere a diver drifts above a broken hull, unaware that beneath him lie 1,000 sentences never finished. On shore, descendants still open boxes of correspondence, brittle, faded, fragile, each word a heartbeat from the past. The film camera pans across old handwriting, light catching on loops of cursive that tremble under glass. The narrator's voice softens, the sound of wind and sea folding together like paper. History, it reminds us, is not written only by victors but by those who hoped to be remembered. Each letter, each name, each pause in speech is a chapter of the same vast elegy. Some are read, most are not. Some stories never returned to shore, they stayed with the tide. The room was bare, the air thick with smoke and history. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz sat at a wooden table, his cap folded neatly before him, his uniform now stripped of power but not of precision. A British intelligence officer clicked on a recorder, the reel whirring softly as questions began, in calm, clipped tones. "When did you know the war was lost?" the officer asked. Dönitz exhaled through his nose, eyes steady on the wall. "When the sea stopped answering," he said. The interpreter paused, translating slowly, aware that this was not just testimony, it was confession. Behind him, on a corkboard, hung a map of the Atlantic dotted with pins, red for lost ships, black for submarines. The admiral's gaze lingered there, as though searching for one pin among thousands. What he didn't yet know was how his words would echo in classrooms and documentaries. His tactical genius now measured against its human toll. History had begun its quiet cross-examination. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King stood by the window of his office, years after the war, watching ships dock in peacetime formation. The walls behind him were covered in maps that had not been updated since 1945, relics of obsession, now fading under sunlight. He poured coffee into a chipped mug and sat, his posture still straight but his eyes softened. Spread across his desk were after-action reports he could no longer amend, only reread. "We won," he murmured once to a junior officer, "but the ocean keeps score differently." The officer said nothing, sensing the gravity behind the words. On the wall hung a photograph of a convoy under attack, the sea erupting in fire, taken years before by a Navy correspondent. King's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the frame. What no one imagined in those days was how victory could feel so weightless once the fight was gone. Even triumph, in the end, had tides. In London's Naval War College, Commander Arthur Miles turned the brittle pages of his wartime log, annotated in pencil and cigarette ash. Each entry was both data and diary, bearings, tonnage, names of ships now long forgotten. He read in silence, the rain tapping against the window as if rehearsing the rhythm of depth charges. 53 convoys protected, 17 attacked, 8 lost, he whispered. Behind every number was a voice, behind every success, a silence. His students would one day learn these figures as clean arithmetic, unaware of the sleepless nights they once represented. On the table beside him lay a photograph of a destroyer crew, smiling. The ink on the back faded. To Arthur, "See you after the sea." He placed it back gently, aligning its edges with care. What he didn't yet know was that memory itself would become a form of command, the duty to remember without justification. Decades later, a package arrived at a small naval museum in Hamburg, addressed simply, "To the family of a sailor." Inside was a letter written by a British escort captain to the family of a German submariner he'd sunk in 1943. It read, "We saw no surrender flag, only courage." The handwriting was steady, its formality softened by empathy. The curator unfolded it carefully, reading aloud for the museum's staff. Outside, tourists passed the building without knowing that inside, a century-old enemy had extended a hand across time. The letter would become an exhibit, not of war, but of reconciliation. Visitors lingered before it longer than before the weapons or the medals. What they didn't yet know was that such gestures were rarer than victories, and far more enduring. Even in defeat, some commanders found a way to honor the humanity beneath the uniform. In coastal pubs from Portsmouth to Kiel, grey-haired sailors gathered in dwindling numbers, their laughter slow and their silences long. They spoke of storms more than battles now, of the taste of coffee on the watch deck, of the smell of diesel mixed with fear. Some carried photographs folded small enough to fit in wallets, faces of those who never came home. "We didn't hate them," one said, gesturing toward the dark horizon outside. We just tried to outlast them. Across the channel, his counterpart in Germany said much the same at his own veterans meeting. The sea had outlived them both. Impartial as ever, in their reminiscence, there was no bitterness, only fatigue tempered by understanding. The cause that had divided them now felt smaller than the element that had united them: survival. What they didn't yet know was how their quiet shared wisdom would become the moral compass for generations who studied war without living it. In 1965, a television crew filmed Dönitz in his modest home near Hamburg. The camera focused on his hands, aged but precise, as he turned a glass of water between his fingers. The interviewer asked, "Do you regret it?" He smiled faintly, neither cruel nor kind. "Regret is for those who believe they had choices," he said. A pause followed, longer than editing would ever allow today. Outside, the sound of children playing drifted faintly through the open window. History, for the first time, seemed to sit across from him as an equal, neither accusing nor absolving. What they didn't yet know, those watching at home, was how modern war would echo these same moral riddles. The sea, indifferent as ever, waited for the next generation to learn its lessons the hard way. In Annapolis, Admiral King's surviving aides gathered for a reunion, spreading old charts across a table in a quiet conference hall. The ink had faded to sepia, the names of lost ships marked by tiny crosses. A younger officer traced his finger along a convoy route and asked, "How did you keep track of so much, sir?" One of the veterans smiled. "We didn't. We just kept moving." Their laughter was gentle, not nostalgic, but knowing. For a moment the room felt lighter. History softened by camaraderie. The war had been a lifetime ago, yet the rhythm of duty still lingered in their posture, in the way they folded maps. What no one imagined then was that the charts themselves would one day hang in museums, their lines transformed from tactics into testimony. Every mark of ink was a heartbeat, every coordinate a story. As the film fades, we see Dönitz in his garden, pruning roses with methodical care. In another frame, an aging American admiral places a wreath at a naval cemetery, wind tugging gently at his coat. Across nations and decades, the camera lingers on faces marked not by pride, but by the serenity of survival. Their voices when they speak are low, men accustomed to command now content to listen. They talk of weather, of duty, of young officers who remind them of ghosts. Each carries a silence that no interview can quite capture. The war has ended, but its echoes persist in the distance between their words. The narrator's voice slows, reflective, like the sea itself withdrawing from shore. The great commanders of Operation Drumbeat and the Atlantic War had not been defeated by each other, but by time. They spoke softly, as if afraid to wake the past. The camera opens not on a ship or a man, but on light itself, slanting through green water, dissolving into the stillness of depth. The ocean breathes in slow motion, particles drifting like forgotten dust motes in a vast liquid cathedral. A diver's bubbles rise in silver spirals, ascending past steel ribs and coral that gleam in the fractured sun. A school of fish sweeps through a doorway, once sealed by pressure and command, their movement effortless. Where once there was struggle, the sea is calm now, but every current carries a story. It has absorbed not just the wrecks, but the intent, the fear, the orders, the courage of those who sank here. The camera drifts through silence, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of distant sonar, a sound that feels like the ocean remembering its own pulse. What the divers don't yet know is that each wreck they study is not just an artifact, but a confession, a record the sea has chosen to keep. The Atlantic, long a witness, has become an archivist, and the light keeps descending, illuminating memory one ripple at a time. Beneath 100 feet of water, a torpedo tube yawns open, its mouth crusted with coral blooms that resemble flowers offered by the tide. Crabs move across a periscope now draped in algae, their shells clicking softly, the sound of time in miniature. Marine biologists hover nearby, noting the delicate web of life that has turned steel into sanctuary. Oxygen tanks hiss. Underwater lights sweep across riveted panels marked faintly, with numbers once etched by hand. The war's precision has softened into nature's patience. Each bolt and beam, once forged for destruction, now supports a reef alive with color. A moray eel curls where sailors once stood watch. The boundaries between life and loss dissolved in salt and shadow. What no one imagined in 1942 was that the weapons of conflict would one day become havens of creation. The sea, indifferent to human design, has rewritten the purpose of these machines. The camera pans slowly, reverently, rust transformed into rhythm. A modern research vessel hovers above, its hull slicing through blue water with quiet authority. Inside, technicians watch a sonar screen glowing green in the dim cabin. Each ping returns a topography of memory, outlines of submarines, debris fields, twisted anchors half buried in sand. The hum of the sonar is both mechanical and mournful, a language the sea understands. The captain leans closer, tracing his finger along a shape that resembles the ghost of a ship. The instruments have replaced periscopes, but the gaze is the same. Men searching through darkness for truth. Every sound wave ripples through history, touching hulls that once prowled silently and now rest forever still. What they don't yet know is that each signal they send disturbs something ancient, not the wreck, but the weight of memory itself. Above them, gulls circle idly, unaware that the sea below is speaking back. Technology, for all its clarity, still cannot fathom everything the ocean remembers. If the ocean could speak, it would not use words, only movement. The currents slide through fractured hulls like fingers turning the pages of a forgotten book. Sand drifts into cabins over rusted compasses and shattered glass. The tide recites its endless verses, reshaping wreckage into rhythm. The U-boat graveyards off the Carolinas and Newfoundland are not places of silence but of quiet conversation. Every tide carries fragments from one to another, a rivet here, a shard there, as if the sea were slowly weaving its own continuity. What the surface world doesn't yet know is how alive the deep still is, how it tends its ruins like a gardener. Coral grows over names, barnacles over numbers, but remembrance is not erased, it is diffused. Even decay, underwater, feels like devotion. The ocean keeps what humans try to forget. On a summer morning, divers from Germany and the United States descend together into the Atlantic, their mission shared, their lineage divided. One places a small plaque on a wreck, a brass plate inscribed with two words, "Werinnen," why remember. The other sets a wreath beside it, wrapped in both flags, the fabric fluttering gently in the current. Their air bubbles rise side by side, indistinguishable as they vanish toward the light above. In the research vessel later, they speak quietly of families, of peace, of how similar the sea feels no matter which shore you're from. The footage captures no grand gesture, only a simple return, the living acknowledging the dead in the element that claimed them. What they didn't yet know was that this act, repeated across decades and oceans, would outlast all the speeches. The sea, impartial and eternal, receives all such offerings without judgment. Forgiveness, it seems, is already written into the water. Autonomous submersibles roam these depths now, silent custodians of the wrecks they once hunted. Cameras glide through pressure and darkness, their lenses adjusting where human eyes cannot. A robotic arm lifts a fragment of porcelain, embossed faintly with an eagle and anchor. The artifact is logged, scanned, and returned, untouched, as though even machines feel reverence here. In a control room thousands of miles away, scientists monitor their progress, the screens glowing with outlines of the deep. Every sonar ping, every data stream becomes a kind of prayer, science speaking softly into the void. The sea answers in echoes, consistent and infinite. What no one imagined then in the era of war was that someday humanity would build machines not to conquer the ocean but to listen to it. The reckoning at last is not revenge but understanding. The steel that once divided men now connects them through curiosity. The camera sweeps over the Atlantic at dawn, waves rolling gently, golden light tracing the same route where convoys once bled into the horizon. There are no torpedoes now, no smoke, no distress flares, only gulls and the pulse of tides older than empires. Beneath those waves lie hundreds of hulls, each one a stanza in the sea's unfinished poem. Modern ships pass overhead, carrying goods, families, futures, the ocean bearing them all with the same indifference it once bore destruction. History has submerged, but it hasn't vanished. The sonar hum remains faint, a heartbeat of remembrance under all that calm. What the world doesn't yet know is that even peace leaves an echo, not of silence but of gratitude. The war has ended, but its resonance still hums beneath the bow. Every swell that breaks upon the shore carries the faint memory of steel and souls intertwined. At last the camera descends once more into the depths, following light as it fades into blue. The wrecks appear distant, softened by time, their sharpness dulled into sculpture. No voices remain, no movement, only the gentle hum of the deep, constant, patient, eternal. A lone current brushes across a rusted nameplate, lifting a small cloud of silt that drifts upward like smoke from a long extinguished fire. The ocean watches, as it always has, holding the past without need for judgment. Above, the surface shimmers, a shifting mirror between memory and forgetting. The sonar falls silent, the divers rise, and the narrator's voice, quiet now, leaves us with the ocean's final truth. The sea forgets nothing. It only whispers softer with each passing tide. A child's laughter splits the morning as a small hand scoops warm sand into a plastic bucket, the tide edge glinting where oil once blackened the shore. On the promenade, Maria Santos ties a sun hat on her daughter and watches a kite dip and swell against a calm sky. The hotel below freshly painted and busy with summer bookings. Fishing boats slide past the horizon in neat arcs, engines idling at steady RPM as nets cascade in practiced motion, the hum of diesel familiar as a lullaby. Beach volunteers pick up plastic again and again, a civic ritual that now replaces the frantic cleanups of another era. At the pier, a docent at the Coastal History Museum unlocks a case and arranges a rusted brass wheel, careful with gloves as if holding a fragile life. The plaque beside it reads the ship's name and the date of sinking, terse facts that struggle to hold feeling. Local historians like Professor Ann Whitaker prepare a school group to learn both technique and tenderness, how to read a map and how to feel a loss. The water smells of salt and sunscreen, ordinary and uncanny at once. What they didn't yet know, as they play and teach and tend, is how many quiet repositories of memory lie just beneath their keel. The coast has been reclaimed, but memory persists like a tide line on the sand. Out on a calm morning, the trawlerman's sonar returns a scatter of shapes, and the skipper, Jonah Keith, eases the throttle, curious rather than fearful. He marks a GPS waypoint and radios the harbour, a familiar code now used for mapping rather than alarm. Below his stern, long-sunken hulls rest like sleeping whales, barnacled and home to crab, shrimp, and the occasional flounder. The fisherman's nets sometimes bring up artifacts, a corroded hinge, a length of chain, which are rinsed and handed to the museum rather than tossed. Jonah remembers hearing stories from his grandfather about nights of flame on the horizon, stories that once felt apocryphal, now grounded in charts and dive logs. The local seafood market posts a small sign explaining why certain fishing grounds are intentionally avoided out of respect and for safety. Scientists from a university research vessel coordinate with fishermen, sharing bathymetry data that turns folklore into precise coordinates. The cause, a war long past, shaped the geography fishermen now use as livelihood. The effect is a living coastline balanced between commerce and memory. No one imagines the sea forgets. It rearranges. Inside the Coastal History Museum, lights warm old metal into something almost domestic as curators prepare a new exhibit on the wartime shore. Curator Daniel Price places a periscope fragment behind glass and adjusts the caption to include voices, excerpts from letters, diary lines, and survivor testimony. School children press close to the barrier, their small faces lit by display cases that show both machinery and the human artifacts that redeem it. A child's shoe, a teacup, a telegram browned with time. The exhibit refuses to let technology overshadow people. Alongside sonar schematics are names of dock workers who mounted the first blackouts and volunteers who pulled survivors from the surf. Visitors linger in the oral history alcove where grandparents speak into a microphone and tell stories that will be indexed and preserved. The museum partners with international archives, swapping scans of logbooks and photographs so the coastal story is not local, alone, but part of a wider memory. What they didn't yet know when the first fragments were hauled ashore was how essential preserving these objects would become to communal healing. Cause, conflict and loss produced an effect that is now deliberate remembrance. The museum is both classroom and chapel, a place where the coast's present and past meet. At a surf school, instructors teach paddle technique and wave reading, cautioning novices about rip currents while weaving in brief history. This is where a tanker once burned. This is where a wreck lies deeper. The rhythm of learning keeps the town alive and shows a new kind of stewardship. Enjoyment married to awareness. Lifeguards on their towers scan the water with binoculars, part of a civic watch that is professional rather than panicked, trained to rescue, but also to recognize the markers of old wreck fields. Local councils maintain plaques on dunes telling of blackouts and coastal convoys. Small public admissions that the shoreline has been both casualty and cradle. What they didn't yet know, perhaps, is how the practice of recreation could itself become ritualized homage. A surf competition pauses 1 minute each year to remember those lost at sea. The effect is subtle but profound. The living incorporate remembrance into daily life without diminishing joy. Children learn to skip stones and to pause for a wreath. Families build sand castles, and at the edge of play read a plaque. The coastline's reclamation is not only ecological or economic, it is moral and cultural. The same waves that once carried warning now carry laughter and ritual alike. In a small university office, Professor Whitaker pores over digitized Admiralty reports and dive logs, knitting together patterns that move from strategy into story. She annotates a map showing wreck distributions with notes about convoy routes, tanker choke points, and later remediation efforts. Graduate students help cross-reference family archives, bringing oral testimony into alignment with technical documents. Together they publish papers that make the local history legible to wider audiences, not as dry catalogue but as human geography. Museums and universities collaborate to reconstruct sunken narratives, each citation a thread sewn from living memory to academic method. What they didn't yet know when they began cataloguing scattered artifacts was how these studies would influence policy on coastal management and heritage protection. The effect is practical: protected zones, controlled salvage permits, and public education programs. Scholarship here is civic practice, knowledge that reshapes how a community cares for its shore. The historians become stewards as much as chroniclers. In towns that once kept long blackouts and air raid drills, storefronts now sell surf wax and postcards, but veterans' banners still hang on main streets during Remembrance Weeks. Local bakeries bake loaves with recipes unchanged since the rationing era, and veterans' organizations host talks connecting a century's trials. Economic regeneration followed a hard arc: ports modernized, piers rebuilt, tourism returned. But with adaptive memory embedded in planning, emergency services include dive teams trained to work with archaeologists. When artifacts resurface, schools include maritime history in the curriculum annually. Couples marry on beaches that would once have borne news of loss. Photographs taken with the horizon as witness rather than threat. What they didn't yet know was how durable that cultural integration would be. Remembrance would not be occasional. It would become woven into identity. The effect is a resilient coast, aware of its past and committed to its future. The same waves that carried death now cradle the living. A visiting German diver and a local American historian share coffee on a museum veranda, their conversation moving from technical details to the human residue of war. They exchange dive coordinates and oral history contacts. Names that once belonged to enemies now become points of shared inquiry. Families on both sides of the Atlantic correspond through archives, comparing stories about lost letters and names etched in stone. These cross-cultural ties complicate tidy narratives of victory and defeat, revealing instead a tangled human geography of grief and curiosity. What no one imagined in 1942 was that the coastlines once threatened by flame would in time be the meeting places of reconciliation. The effect is modest but real. Friendships formed around wrecks, joint commemorations, and collaborative exhibits. Memory, once a burden, becomes a bridge. The ocean's long arc now carries not just history but connection. As the camera pulls back over a late afternoon beach, children run and elders walk and fishermen prepare for an evening haul, the light pooling golden on a world that knows both joy and loss. Buoys mark protected sites. A small flotilla of research boats idles politely as divers descend in routine, not panic. Museums close for the day with the careful ritual of locking away both ruin and reverence. Exhibits dimming like a congregation departing. Town clocks tick in measured time, indifferent to the past's urgency but shaped by it nonetheless. The narrator's voice softens: these shores once burned, now they breathe. The sea continues its patient work, carrying history in ways both visible and invisible. And a community tends that memory with ordinary acts of living. In the hush between waves and wind, one truth remains vivid and simple. The same waves that carried death now cradle the living. The diesel-electric growl softened as the modern submarine slipped beneath mirror-smooth water, and Lieutenant Commander Anna Voss watched the horizon narrow through the periscope of her boat with a practiced calm. Her fingertips rested against the console where digital displays replaced the brass and glass of another age, and the hull's steady hum translated into a kind of measured heartbeat. Outside, the sea took her vessel without comment, folding the shape of steel into its own slow geometry. as gulls wheeled above and fishing boats traced placid arcs far from the channel. In the Combat Information Center, a sonar technician named Marcus Hale adjusted filters and listened to the orchestra of the deep, the low chatter of distant propellers, the sonar hush of whales, the faint, consistent echo that hinted at a wreck below. A screen cleared to outline a shadow on the seabed, the silhouette of a hull transformed by time into sculpture, and a diver's small light appeared as if in answer. The modern boat's mission was benign: mapping, training, boundary patrol, yet every instrument read like a page in a ledger written long before. Captain Voss made a note in her log and spoke quietly to her crew about seamanship and memory. The two joined as if by tradition. Above them the sun slowly dipped, painting the water a steady, forgiving blue. The present moved forward on the shoulders of the past, steady but conscious. In that hush, the ocean did what it always does. It received without prejudice. A century earlier, Renhardaghan peered through a periscope not to chart seas for science, but to seek silhouettes to sink, and his hands knew the cold geometry of torpedo angles and gyro settings with an intimacy that now read like ritual. His maps once bristled with pins indicating prey and profit. His log recorded calculated shots and the rough arithmetic of tonnage. On the other side of the ocean, Admiral Ernest King once unfolded similar charts in rooms thick with cigarette smoke, his decisions measured in convoys and resources, his mind sharpened by both urgency and a profound wariness. Those men moved history with mechanical tools and the tremor of human judgment, and their choices echoed in the steel that now rests under silt and coral. The cause and effect are simple to any student of war. Invention met need, aggression met response, and industry remade the balance of danger. The hunters and the hunted exchanged roles in sequences written by technology and endurance, each adaptation provoking another until the sea itself seemed to adjudicate the contest. What they didn't yet know then, Hardeggan, King, or the young sonar tech in 1942, was how enduring the conversation between machine and ocean would become, or how the wrecks would teach later generations to listen rather than to strike. A diver named Marcus Dyer, not the sonar technician, but the coastal archaeologist from Beaufort, eased his light into a control room and watched sediment settle like sleep over a captain's chair. The logbooks he found there were half-fused, ink splayed into the texture of water and time, and when he carefully lifted a page it crumbled like dried leaf. The words remained legible enough to make the heart stumble. He read the last entries aloud, voices trembling in his helmet, and those phrases travelled up into films and archives, sowing private grief into public record. Families in 2 continents later sat in small rooms and watched that footage with hands folded, recognizing the cadence of loss in the clipped terms that once masked fear with duty. Museum curators translated these fragments into exhibits that balanced technical description, torpedo type, depth ratings, hull steel thickness, with human stationery, letters, photographs, watch lists. Engineers studied hull failure and adjusted designs. Naval officers taught new cadets the lesson that every specification has a human consequence. The wrecks became classrooms as well as graves. The effect was cumulative. Knowledge born of destruction became the scaffolding for safety, policy, and remembrance. No one imagined the quiet dignity with which those lessons would be taught, decades after the engines had fallen silent. Above the waves, a historian named Dr. Helala Ramos traced lines of correspondence between Admiralty dispatches and the recorded stops on a convoy's voyage, watching how bureaucratic language codified loss into policy. She argued in lectures that Drumbeat's true significance lay not merely in tonnage statistics, but in how a nation learns, how panic yields doctrine, and how doctrine becomes doctrine only after lives are spent. Her students, some reading her words on bright screens, would enter careers where logistics and memory intersect, humanitarian shipping, deep-sea archaeology and naval architecture. The ripple from a single night of fire on the water, she taught, moves through industries and classrooms, and eventually becomes part of civic life. These are the quieter afterlives of conflict, the standards, the manuals, the curriculum that outlive headlines. In search rooms and in practice, the technical and the moral entwine. Sonar calibrations sit beside ethical debates about wreck disturbance and the rights of descendant communities. What they didn't yet know in the immediate aftermath was that such institutional change would endure beyond political cycles. The sea's lessons, taught patiently, reshape not only battle plans but the way societies protect and remember. In ports where once black smoke had turned nights orange, small ceremonies now mark anniversaries with wreaths, and the ringing of bells calibrated to sound a respectful human pitch. Local elders recite names and dates from plaque lists, each syllable measured and clear. Children release small biodegradable wreaths into the surf, watching them float and dissolve with solemn curiosity. Former sailors sometimes attend and press the cool metal of the memorial plaques with roughened fingers, reading names that were once merely lines on a report, now made real and ritual. On the pier, a quiet conversation unfolds between a retired U-boat mechanic from Germany and a Coast Guard veteran from Massachusetts. They talk about rivets and pumps and the practicalities of salvage, and in that exchange a kind of reconciliation, technical, human, inevitable, has taken root. Museums on both sides of the Atlantic curate similar displays and co-publish catalogues that cross-reference names, coordinates, and oral histories, turning once partisan archives into shared repositories. The practical work of remembering, conservation, site protection, educational outreach occupies the same calendars that once scheduled military sorties. The effect is a turning outward from recrimination to stewardship, an ethic that the sea's claims must be met with care. No one imagined at the war's height that such cooperation would follow so soon. Technologists now point to the same sonar echoes that once undid submarines and say they are the raw data of memory, a language the ocean speaks if one listens long enough. Autonomous gliders map fine-grained topography, cataloguing wrecks in 3 dimensions and recording biological succession over decades. Data sets are shared in open repositories where naval architects, marine biologists and historians converge in collaborative projects, translating technical outputs into policy recommendations and commemorative designs. In this modern chorus, a software engineer can draw a line from an algorithm optimizing convoy routing to a museum label that explains why a ship rested where it did. The arc from wartime urgency to peacetime utility is not linear. It is braided with ethics and contested claims about salvage, ownership, and memory. What they didn't yet know in the first frantic months of conflict was that the instruments born to kill would be adapted to heal and to teach. The cause, the imperative to survive, produced effect after effect until even hardware designed for stealth now serves visibility and preservation. In small rooms lit by the blue glow of monitors, descendants read the names of the lost aloud into microphones for oral history projects that will live beyond any single archive. They speak not only of loss but of ordinary things, a favorite pastry, a voice on the phone, a joke told in the mess. Those small domestic notes give shape to the vast statistics, humanizing the ledger and insisting that history contain faces and textures and feet on sand. Volunteers stitch together exhibits, align scans, and build repositories that make the past accessible without flattening it. The community work of remembering becomes civic infrastructure. Plaques become curricula. Memorials become sites of learning and care. The effect is a culture that equates remembrance with responsibility, where a shoreline's upkeep includes legal protections for submerged cultural heritage. No one imagined that such granular care would grow from the rubble of conflict, yet here it stands, institutions and people bound into a living archive. The submarine surfaces at dusk, a small black fin breaking water with the courtesy of an animal exhaling, and Lieutenant Commander Voss pens the final log entry of the day with a hand steady from training and softened by thought. She writes not only coordinates and engine hours, but a note about a wreath laid at a recorded wreck site by divers that morning, a small human touch in a log thick with numbers. Above, the horizon folds into night. Below, sonar echoes fade into the same soft darkness that has housed wrecks since the first engines soundlessly broke surface and sank. The camera pulls back slowly, the ocean widening until the rim of the world seems to hold every story at once. Machinery and men, error and courage, loss, and the long work of remembrance. In that final openness, the narrator's voice softens and becomes almost a conversation with the sea itself, acknowledging that history lives both in archives and in the quiet pulse beneath the waves. Beneath the calm Atlantic, their echoes remain, reminders that even in silence, history breathes.